Thank you for agreeing to participate in this interview for my school project. Can you start off by maybe just telling us a little bit about yourself and your background, whatever you feel like sharing?
Yeah, so for the last 6 years, I've been a English teacher in Taiwan and China. I worked at an international school in Taiwan, and I worked for a couple of universities in Sichuan for about 2 years, and since then I was in Fujian province on the coast opposite Taiwan for about 2 years at a middle school with
Uh-huh.
English. I'm from London.
Uh-huh.
A bachelor's degree in English literature and a master's in history. And yeah, this is my career. I'm based in China.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm with Justin now, and thank you for joining me for this interview. So you're American, you're an American in China, right?
Yeah, correct. Glad to be here.
And okay, cool. And can you maybe just take a moment, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, maybe where you're from in America, maybe what you studied, anything you'd like to share, just to introduce yourself.
Absolutely. 35 years old. I studied business management. I was considered a non-traditional student. I started at the age of 25, went for the Pell Grant, and graduated around 2012. My background, I guess you could say, uh, in my younger days, I was an aspiring golf professional, competed at a local level. Didn't really win any money in tournaments, but won some money in the local dog fights and local tournaments, local club championships and stuff like that. But then I started teaching golf to children. We were kind of like a on-site company that went to various schools and just used training tools and taught children around elementary and sometimes middle school. And I thought that was a unique experience.
Okay.
I also have some junior clinic training as well with the past clubs that I've worked for. So I definitely think that teaching has always been a valuable thing that I've done. I've really enjoyed it. So I would say that that's the bulk of what I've done in my past. And then as I got my undergrad, I worked for a small financial company and worked for the operations department where I just approved documents and just validated their account information. And then after that, my ex-wife's company transferred her to the Philippines, lived there for 2 years. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to work due to visa situation. And then after that, they flew us to Ireland, lived there for a very short time, and then decided I need to move on to bigger and better things. And that's when I decided to become an English teacher. Went through the 120-hour TEFL certification and looked online. And even though I visited about 15 countries, I needed something a little bit different, something that a place where I haven't been before, and China felt like that was the best fit. And I have never really heard of Balto, Inner Mongolia, which is where I'm currently residing, and I felt like that was a place where I can learn something where it's not to the traditional Han Chinese culture. It does have a mix of the Mongolian culture as well. So I do feel like I'm learning something day by day.
So I'm speaking with Mike right now. And to begin, Mike, I would like to ask you to just maybe introduce yourself, tell us a little bit maybe about your background, where you grew up, maybe what you studied in college, hobbies, whatever you think is worth sharing.
Okay, sure. My name is Mike Waiteka. I am from San Jose, California, which is right next to San Francisco. I was an elementary school teacher for 5 years, and After that, I took a short break to wrestle. I got to wrestle for the United States, travel around, and compete in some really unique places. And from there, that kind of inspired me to want to teach abroad when I came back to teaching. My education background was world religions and ancient history, but I taught elementary school, which is all subjects, and then I came to teach in China.
Wow, that's really interesting. So you actually were a teacher in America for 5 years before you went to China.
Correct, yes.
All right, so today I am speaking with Edward. Edward, thank you for participating. Would you please take a moment, maybe just introduce yourself, tell us something about who you are, your background?
Okay, well, just real fast, I grew up on the coast of California, Central Coast, Santa Cruz, and I don't know, I guess I was just like kind of a skater kid when I was in high school, and then hung out for a couple of years, did a little traveling in Central America, and then I went to college. After college, it was a little bit hard for me to find work, but I did like substitute teaching, like local high schools and stuff like that. And then I went off and taught abroad in Colombia, and that was a good experience. Mostly like high school kids and like early college kids and stuff. And I found that really rewarding. They seem to show a lot more respect towards like teachers and stuff than I got as like a substitute teacher, definitely.
So you've taught in California, Colombia, and China.
Correct.
When you first went to China, your very first time, what were some things that maybe surprised you about the culture, just the day-to-day, the habits? What were some things that sort of stood out to you that you noticed?
So I went to Taiwan, first of all, after I graduated in 2015.
Oh, okay. Well, didn't you go to China in 2003 to be a travel agent?
Yeah, well, that was the first time, yeah.
So let's talk about that. Because that's totally different from Taiwan, in my opinion.
Yeah. Oh, at 2003, yeah, I was amazed by it. What stood out was just like the proportions of I was in Beijing, just like these huge buildings. The energy, you could sense it as soon as you got there, like the verve in the air. It's just bustling city, everyone going to work, and it's just completely dwarfs anything I've seen in England. And I was in the financial district of England, my first job at 16. It's just another thing. So I like that about it. And my memories, they're probably possibly misguided. You know, it's a long time ago now, so it's 17 years. But I remember the Chinese being very friendly then and very curious about foreigners, because there wasn't many of us in Beijing. So I like that about it, just like I mean, having spent a long time in China now, this seems a strange thing to say, but like a kind of civility. Now I often complain about how rude the Chinese are, but then to me they were more sort of like smiley and curious about you and polite. I remember, of course, there was the spitting and so on, but there was a touching personality to it, you know. Whereas in England, you'd be ignored by everyone. You get on the train to work, no one looks at each other. You could spend your whole day not talking to anyone. So it was that stood out for me. And I was actually my office was based in a kind of huton. It was South Stanley Twin.
So tell the audience what a hutong is.
It's like a small alley, like a small road, a traditional road in Beijing. A lot of them have been knocked down. I mean, it wasn't a proper hutong, but it was a small alley of bars, and there would be lots of alleys going off of it. And I suppose the buildings were built in the 60s or 70s. It wasn't quite modern. It wasn't ancient either, but it had an old feel to it. And they since knocked down that bar street and just built like super new, glacier, glassy shopping mall and just completely wiped it of any character it had. But it was good back then. I loved it, and the bars and the beer was cheap, and yeah, I liked it. I was quite surprised though by one thing, really surprised, because my office was on Sanlitun, the Bar Street, and that whole area of Beijing, there were lots of African, and they were selling drugs to a man. They were selling drugs, and they would solicit tourists. You know, standard street where they go in the bars and they'd buy drinks and they'd get talking. But that's what they did, and that was every African I knew, and there were a lot. So I was quite surprised by a country that I'd heard was hard on human rights and strict with some crimes, especially drugs, that they allowed this to go on, and it's pretty much obvious.
Well, maybe they're not aware. I don't know, but I remember 3 or 4 years ago, I think I went to Sanlitun with a friend, and we were out kind of late, and then we were walking on the street, and then African guys were just randomly approaching us, asking us if we wanted to buy drugs, and I was like, yeah, no thanks. I was kind of surprised by that, but I have experienced that myself, being approached. So what was the first year you actually got into education in China? When did you start teaching in China? What year was that?
It was sporadic before, because it was easy to get a visa, so I could go on off, you know. I could do it on off. But I was drinking a lot in that time. I never took it seriously. But I suppose the first year in China, the mainland. Was 2016. That's when I was conscientious about my job and sober, and never missed a lesson. I never missed one lesson there. I was doing about 12 hours a week in Sichuan. Only on 6.
Was this a high school or a university, or what kind of school was it?
Yeah, university, Xihua Shifan Daxue, which is China West Normal University. And middle school students. To be honest, I was just I was struck and stressed eventually by just how sort of bland and simple the students were. It was just their level of English, but also their ideation and comprehension wasn't able to get a grasp very complex subjects, but they weren't that complex. You know, it's pretty straightforward, but just asking a basic question could often be hard.
Can you give an example, or can you elaborate on that point? Because I kind of have a sense of what you're saying, but can you get into that a little bit more?
Yeah, well, as I talk about what my colleagues put a video, and this was sort of is emblematic of my own experiences, but he said, look for the cultural differences. He showed a video of a Chinese family. It's called Off the Boat, and he was in the classroom next to me, so I saw this go on. But he put a video on called Off the Boat. It's about a Chinese family who arrive in America, and it was about 40 minutes long. And he said, look for the cultural differences, note them down, explain to me how they're different. And then he asked for an answer to his question. No one volunteered. Finally, he chooses someone. Can you tell me one cultural difference? He waited there for 5 minutes, a long time in the classroom. And finally, she said, American family eat hamburger, Chinese family eat noodles. But that wasn't.
Sounds like it.
Yeah, but that wasn't actually in the video. They weren't eating noodles, and no American family were eating hamburgers. So it seems to me that sometimes it's hard for them to spot the obvious, but this is very general. Sometimes students have been quite clever. Just thinking about that specific time now.
Sure, I've had similar incidents where, I ask what I think is not that complicated of a question, and then no one volunteers, and then I wait, and then I get, here's a different example, but it's kind of similar, I think. I was in Beijing for a few years, and I worked for a polytechnic college for 2 years in Beijing, and I had high school students, and I remember often on Mondays I would, be in high spirits, had the weekend, and I would ask students in the class, say, what would you do? What did you do over the weekend? Now, without me telling you, try to guess. What do you think they said? What did you do over the weekend?
Sleeping.
Right. I would usually get the holy trinity of response. It would be eating, sleeping, and then it would be like eat, sleep, play game. And I'd be like, okay, next student, what did you do over the weekend? Eating, sleeping, play game. Okay, the next student. And then it would just be like the same thing, or some would just say sleeping. Occasionally someone might say study, but it was always like eating, sleeping, play game. And it was like, that was it. And it'd be like, well, yeah, obviously you slept. Like, I slept over the weekend too. I just don't know if that's really noteworthy. Like,
yeah.
But,
Yeah.
and I feel like that's such a Chinese thing. I feel like if you went to a high school or a university in your country or my country, and maybe students are learning Mandarin and maybe their Mandarin's not great, so they're limited in their responses, they would still try to come up with something better than eating, sleeping, play game. Maybe they would fumble the pronunciation or the grammar, but in terms of the actual response, the content, I think people would try to find something more interesting or creative than what you typically find in China. And that's sort of one of the things about China that maybe saddens me a bit is just there seems to be a total lack of, like you said, bland. I feel like there's such a lack of creativity and originality, and there's so much just students saying the same things, and sometimes it's just like I wonder, are you really trying, or are you just, is that as far as your mind goes? Or I sometimes I just don't know what to make of it. But it's not uncommon, and I've heard a lot of teachers have similar experiences and observations.
Yeah. I've never heard of teachers not having those experiences. And it's amazing the levels of institutions, the different areas, they're saying the same things. So all the students in the classroom can almost become like one organism. I used to refer to it as the Hydra. So asking a question like that, what did you do at the weekend? And you just got to get through them all, or through some of them.
The Hydra. That's interesting.
Yeah.
I never heard of that. The Hydra.
Yeah, you have to lock up and get rid of the beast until finally they've all had a little bit to say. It takes the fun away from it, or even the point away from it. So, like, what did you do at the weekend could be a great conversation starter, but you're just going to get these abstract, oh, I was reading, but there'll be no sort of natural impulse to elaborate on that, to talk about what they were reading, how they felt about they were reading, how long did they read for.
It's kind of like stand up, answer the question, sit down.
Yeah,
and it's like that's not what we're going for. We're trying to have some conversation, but again, I feel like in their mindset, it's just like, oh, I just need to give like an answer and then I'm done, and then I'm and it's not like, oh, here's an opportunity for me to express myself and practice. It's like, no, I just want, and in some situations I can understand that. I understand if it's a high school and some students aren't interested, I can get that. But I've had that in universities as well. I've sometimes had that with English majors, and I'm thinking like sometimes I'll have the same students in the past. They would ask me during class or after class, teacher, how can I improve my oral English? And I'd be like, well, you have to practice. And then yet in class, sometimes the same students, they don't participate. And when I give them an opportunity, they have very little to say. And then it's like, well, you asked me how to improve, and you're not going to get better at anything if you don't practice. And what I started doing in recent years is sometimes the first lesson, and sometimes I'll bring this up multiple times in the semester, but I would ask my students, I would kind of turn the tables on them and say, I would say, you know, students, I know someone who is learning to play piano. How do you think he can improve at piano? And, you know, they would be silent, and then maybe they would chatter a bit, and then someone might say, oh, well, you have to practice. And I'd be like, right. And then I would, you know, what about swimming? What about basketball? What about, you know, how do you get better at these things? And they'd be like, oh, well, you know, I'd be like, if I want to become a good basketball player, what should I do? Should I just watch people play basketball? Should I join a basketball team and just sit on the bench? And they'd be like, no, you have to play. And I'd be like, well, that's how you improve your English. And to me, that just seems so obvious, but sometimes I feel like I have to really spell things out and simplify it for them. Have you had experiences like that, or does that just, you think that's unique to me?
They always in the introduction say, "Oh, teacher, how do I improve my English?" And I just said, "Well, read books. You know, that's how you're going to get your vocabulary, and the grammar will, you know, almost like by osmosis, you'll get the grammar." And it's like if they went to England or America or any Anglophone country, eventually they'll just pick up the grammar without looking at their rule books like they do in China. It's another thing in China. They seem to know a lot about grammar, the different rules and structures, but then they can't use it. So it's definitely a discord from all that study and use, just as you said, you know, it's about using it. But
Right.
yeah, the grammar's all over the place. Another thing I noticed is that they all, in the introduction classes, I talk about, you know, introduce your hobbies, and they would all be the same. I like playing basketball. I like reading. Sometimes it'd be reading, or a lot.
Have you ever had? Go ahead.
I like watching TV dramas. Like, what TV dramas do you like? It's like Korean TV drama. Someone's like, okay. And then there was some trouble with Korea in 2016. I think there was a satellite missile system being built in defense system being built in South Korea. So suddenly all the Chinese are pissed with Koreans, and they start smashing up Korean cars, but owned by Chinese people. And I remember this girl who told me she liked Korean drama. Somehow we were talking again, and I said, "Oh yeah, you like Korean drama, don't you?" And she went, "No, don't." I said, "But first class, you told me you like watching Korean soap dramas." And she was like, "No, never said that." I went, "You did." So, well, why don't you
Everyone's
like it?
watching.
And everyone was just silent. And I just thought, wow, the nationalism that runs through, that can even efface someone's private enjoyments, you know, that quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. Ask you, what were maybe some of the first things that surprised you about just day-to-day Chinese life, Chinese culture, education, schools, anything? When you first arrived, maybe your first week, your first month, your first year, what are some things some maybe culture shock you had, or some things you noticed that really stood out to you, good or bad or both?
Yeah, there was definitely both. I guess I will start with the more challenging aspects, and that is obviously the lack of bilingual environment with them using Chinese characters. I did not realize how difficult it would be. Before I came here, I didn't really study too much. I just figured I could jump into it because I've visited so many other countries, and I thought, oh, you know, I'm an international traveler. For many years, I can do this. It's no big deal. But even some of the most simplest tasks require a basic knowledge of the language. So that was my biggest challenge. And I'm a fairly open and easygoing guy. I don't get strung up on too many ideas that are fresh in some ways if it's negative. So it really wasn't that bad of an adjustment for me. I also learned about how much a social life does mean to me personally, but how it could mean to any other person. So I moved here not to have a social life, but to really improve on my career. And I would say about 6 months down the road, I thought, Justin, what are you doing? You're spending your life here doing, just doing the same thing every day, not having any kind of outside enjoyment. So I learned how important that is, and I guess that really proved that I am a what's the word I'm looking for? Not introvert, extrovert. I'm an extrovert type person. Even though I've built some introvert style qualities, overall I definitely respond to my surroundings. And I would say that the good thing is I don't see too many foreigners here. And I'm the type of person that just wants to embrace local culture, local individuals, just the way of life itself. I feel like if I spend my time around foreigners or a large group of foreigners, it kind of diminishes my point of being here. So I try to just be a loner in some ways. So in that way, in that respect, it was good. I could actually breathe and for a second and be within my own thoughts instead of always having to, I don't want to say please or anything like that, but entertain. And that's another part of culture here is they do love to entertain people. And I've been on the receiving end of that a lot of times. So I do appreciate the warming, welcoming, like for lack of a better word, of how locals treated me here. Yes, sure, I stand out quite a lot, but I get two responses, and that is they are very open and very excited. They try to speak, but they can't. Or the other reaction is that they just give me that ghost stare, like I'm not really their kind. So I'm sure they know why I'm here, but I can't say that it's the kind of welcome like, hey, yeah, you can come, stay, enjoy yourself. And I've been told this before, where they say, Justin, I'm glad you're enjoying yourself, but you can only be here for a short time. You cannot be here forever. After a certain time, you must go. I thought, oh, thanks.
Yeah.
But I think I
imagine
will
if
make
we
that
said
decision.
that to imagine if we said that to foreigners or immigrants in America.
Yeah, that we would be the bad guy.
Yeah, we'd be the bad guy, but in China it's pretty normal. Or I'm sure you've encountered this. You walk around, you mentioned getting stared at. Do you have a lot of people saying lao wai, and shouting hello at you? Has that ever happened?
Yeah, this does happen, and even to this day, my own community also they call me Lao Wai. But yeah, a lot of people will shout and say hello, especially when I go to other parts, other districts. Those are the ones that maybe they're like, oh, I've never seen him before. Hello, hello. But other than that, yeah, they always call me Lao Wai. And I do understand the positives and the negatives behind it. I don't particularly take any kind of criticism or offense to it. I just take it on the chin like everything else.
Yeah, I don't think it's intended to be negative. I just find, again, this is maybe you feel differently, but I feel like in China they have very much this us and them mindset, in that there's us Chinese people, and then there's everybody else, and everybody else is a foreigner, everybody else is a Laowai. Whereas I feel like that's so different from America. I think we really make distinctions for better or worse. And it's like, well, I'm from the East Coast, I'm from the West Coast, I'm an African American, I'm an Asian American, I'm homosexual. We seem to really put a lot more, create more groups and categories. Whereas I feel like in China, a lot of people just there's Chinese people and there's foreigners. And
Yeah, you're exactly
think of
right.
it that way?
You're exactly right. Now, I do know that there are lots of minorities here, but that's not really spoken about. So it's almost like I don't want to say that they're worthless or anything like that, but they just don't have any kind of power behind their identity. Versus in the U.S., we really do include everyone. We are an inclusive culture. And I've noticed, I've seen this distinction quite contrastly, like where yes, you're right. Here, it's either you're Chinese or you're not. And if you're not, well, they have a certain predisposition. I'm not sure if that's the right word to use about you. They have a certain idea of what your expectations are supposed to be. Not about what your expectations are. They kind of have their own set of expectations for you before maybe you're expendable or whatever. Versus our culture, we really try to include everyone and really try to build a home and make a future that is available for anyone, any race, any nationality. And this is one thing that I talked about with one of the parents. They invited me out to dinner and they said, "Oh, what are the good and bad things about living in China, about living in your country?" And these are just one of the things that I spoke about was the differences of viewpoints and perceptions.
So here's kind of a simple question. What were some of the first things that surprised you your first year in China about the culture, the education, maybe, I don't know, etiquette, organization, lack of organization, anything that comes to mind? What were some things that your first day, your first week, your first year, whatever, that really kind of stood out and grabbed your attention?
Sure. I guess cultural differences, because that's like right when you get off the airplane. That's like that's when you experience some things first. That's I'll talk about class in a moment, but yeah, right when you get off the airplane, I'm like, whoa, the way they just walk around is different than America. Like how they expect like etiquette for walking through a door and where's the line? Should you wait in line? Are people waiting in line? Is it rude to just cut people off? It seems to be no.
Right. Right.
Yeah, and then I, at first like, whoa, this is crazy. I did live in India for 6 months, so I wasn't total culture shock. 'Cause I got to experience something way different, which they have their different, their different norms. Yeah, so I noticed that like etiquette for waiting in line or restaurant service or just crossing the street. There's so many things that are just different here. And again, they're not rude or mean. I find actually everyone here to be very friendly, polite, and helpful. But as they're going through their day, everyone's just doing their thing. Like they're not. Yeah.
Let me remark on that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Consideration, exactly. The thing my wife and I sort of joke around or observe, and this is kind of what you're saying, is I feel like, yeah, in public and in crowds, Chinese people are pretty inconsiderate by American standards because, yeah, they sort of push and shove and they don't stand in line and they'll cut in line. And for a lot of Western people, it's really a headache. But individually, often one-on-one, they are very friendly and very polite. And it's just, I feel like dealing with individual Chinese is one thing and dealing with crowds of Chinese anonymously is like a totally different thing, and that's kind of what you're describing.
Yeah, so what I realize is they're like, by my standards and their own standards, they're not being inconsiderate because no one's getting mad at each other. Everyone's just doing it. But of course, if in America, if you do that, you're should be like, wait, you're breaking social convention and you're being a jerk. Whereas they're not breaking social convention. That's why it's not rude. It seems that, or at least that's just my understanding of it. No one's getting mad when people are just doing this. They're just like, all right, this is how we do things here. Small example was like when I was in India, like driving here in China is a little crazy. I don't drive here, but I mean, just road.
Being in a taxi is crazy.
In India, it's even crazier. People will just turn around on the road and go the wrong direction down. I'm like, it's way more, like insane in that way. And I'm just like, man, this is crazy. But no one's really getting mad about it. They're like, if someone just going the wrong way on the freeway in America, it's like the news and the police are coming. Something crazy is happening. Where it's just like, nah, that person's going somewhere.
Yeah,
and
that's a really good point. And you know what it reminds me of too is I feel like now that I think about it, you know, in some ways I feel like Westerners, you know, like you were talking about traffic, we're very sort of structured and organized and color in the lines, and there's a certain protocol and way to do things, and we do it like with traffic or lining up. Whereas in China, it's a lot more, free spirited or spontaneous, or road traffic laws are more like suggestions than laws, and, and there's a lot more spontaneity. But I feel like intellectually or ideologically or in the classroom, it's almost like opposite. Like all of a sudden, generally, I think the Western classroom can be more spontaneous and think outside the box and so on and so forth. Whereas China, suddenly, it's a lot more structured and orderly in a certain way, and like there's a certain organization that everyone sort of abides by. There's less flow, less spontaneity.
I think that's a great comparison. I never thought about that. Like the flip flop.
I didn't either. Yeah, till just now.
Yeah, in class, it's more like American traffic. It's like everyone knows their lane, and you do this and you do that, and there's a four-way stop, and everyone it's very structured. Whereas the opposite, that's a good flip flop between traffic and classroom structure. I would say I agree with that.
This is what happens when great minds meet. You know, we come up with these great, humble, modest minds. We come up with these. But this is why it's fun for me to chat with other foreign teachers, because, you know, we have similar observations. But and this is the thing about American is I feel like we have this sense that through these discussions and dialogue, ideas like that or comparisons spring forth, and I think that's again sort of our way of thinking is through talking and comparing and analyzing, we come up with ideas. Where again in China, I think it's a lot more rote memorization and learn this and regurgitate it on an exam.
That would be the thing that I noticed when I first came to class here, is that students were very reluctant to express themselves in any creative way. It's a rote learning classroom style where they're like, tell me exactly what I need to do so I can do it the way you want me to. And, you know, so raising your hand to give a direct answer, like what year did this happen? I'll have lots of people wanting to engage. But if I'm asking someone to share their opinion on what they think about something, oh man, that was really hard to get people to the students to engage, especially at first. Yeah,
and again, I think maybe that's almost the opposite in the States. Like a lot of people, not everybody, but I think a lot of us, if you say, you know, tell us the dates of World War II, people will be like, well, I don't know. But it's like, well, what's your opinion about Hitler or Pearl Harbor? And then people might have something to say. People are, you know, we're pretty willing to share our opinions, but sometimes when it just comes to dates or dry facts, people are much less interested, and I kind of think that's better personally.
I you know, always probably somewhere in the middle is probably the best way, because it's a little too extreme, the rote learning in China, and the people's love of their own opinion, even though it's not. I'm serious. Like Americans love their opinion so much, even if it's not structured with facts.
Even if it's in spite of the facts.
I don't know any of the facts, but here's what's true. So knowing that information to have a good opinion is also good. And there's these two opposite ends of the spectrum where it's just like, no, you should probably know something before you have strong opinions. And now that you have all this rote knowledge, you can maybe, you know,
form an opinion.
Form an opinion based on this stuff. So somewhere in the middle's probably the best.
Yeah. In that sense, I do agree. I was just thinking more in the sense of just reciting dates or facts. I think is kind of useless. But obviously you want to have some objective truth and data and understand different sides of history, and then try to develop opinions based on that, of course. But But yeah, I agree. And, you know, I think in a lot of ways, China and America are opposites. One thing I've brought up in some other conversations, maybe you'll agree, maybe you'll disagree, which is fine because we're American, is that I feel like one thing I kind of half joke about and half really mean it is Americans, I find ourselves, we're almost hypercritical of ourselves and our history. And we really like to sort of air our dirty laundry. And, you know, I think generally that's a good thing, but sometimes I think we go a little bit too far. We don't always give ourselves credit for, like, you know, we went to the moon first. We've performed pretty well in the Olympics. We just kind of go like, yeah. But let's talk about all the bad stuff we've done. You know, like, let's shine. And again, I think it's good that we criticize ourselves. I still think we go a little too far, but China, I find it's the opposite. It's like this hypersensitivity to criticism, and you know, yeah, sweeping things under the rug and only sort of bringing out your most beautiful laundry, like your clean laundry, and really, you know, just hypersensitivity. Don't want to criticize anything. And again, I feel like between those two extremes, you have to have some middle ground. You have to, you know, be able to criticize yourself in your society, and we love to do that in America. But, you know, I think it's also good to have some pride and some, yeah, but China's, you know, the other extreme. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling, but what do you think about that?
I would say, well, considering that we have the 3 T's, you know, sweeping history under the rug, that's definitely part of something here. Yeah, like anything you want to bring up that's not going to paint China in a good light, that's like controversial to do. In America, yeah, I agree with you. Like, I think it's good to talk about certain things that are not good in our past so we can correct them. But like you were saying, I think sometimes a little bit of an overcorrection. Maybe just a small example is like, okay, obviously racism and discrimination is bad. I don't think you're going to find anyone who thinks that's well, maybe you'll find a couple people, but most people are going to,
in general,
yeah, they're not going to be like, that's not cool. So we have this idea that we should not do that ever. But then you get, in my opinion, like cultural appropriation, where it's like, if someone's trying to share your culture in a positive way without, you know, stealing in a way that's like stealing money or taking credit, or, you know, or they just want to participate in your culture, you're getting pushback from that a lot now. Like, oh, well, you're not this, so you can't do that, or you're not this, so you can't do that. And it seems like it's like, well, your heart seems to be in the right place, but now you're just actually making someone not even want to learn about you.
And I feel like if you follow some of these things to the extreme, eventually everything is banned, everything is canceled. There's no logos on any brands because everything's offensive, and just, you know what I mean. It's like you end up just like almost eliminating culture appreciation.
So I mean, a good example was this, yeah, and that's true. So Jeremy Lin, Chinese basketball player, right? He was in the NBA, now playing in China. He got cornrows. And there was a black player who was giving him shit about that. So sorry, I can say that. Maybe I can.
That's fine. No, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it.
Okay. So he was giving Jeremy Lin a hard time because he had cornrows and saying that's cultural appropriation. That's not cool. You're not allowed to have cornrows. And Jeremy Lin responded in the most intelligent and nice way possible. He should have just laid into him. That's what I would have done. I'd be so upset. Like, it's just not, you didn't. But he said, because this guy has Chinese character tattoos.
And there you go.
Jeremy Lin just said, you know what? I think it's great that you got Chinese character tattoos to show that you're interested in my culture. Instead of pointing it out in a mean way, he was like, I think it's good that you did that, and I think it's cool that I have cornrows. And I think he solved that problem way better than I would have. I would have been so upset. But it's like, why are we mad at him?
Yeah. No, you're that's great. I didn't hear that. And what it reminds me of is I think it was the 1970s in America and African American culture. Like kung fu movies were really big among African Americans. Like I think the Wu-Tang Clan guys grew up watching kung fu movies. And you know that song, everybody was kung fu fighting? Like, that's a black guy.
Yeah.
And so lots of, historically, lots of black people have, really liked Chinese culture. And I think that's great. And one other point I'll make is when people say cultural appropriation in English and they're not of English descent, I find that a bit ironic. It's like, well, why don't you say that in a different language? Is English your... Because, if we really want to get technical and start, well, this is mine, you can't have it. It's like, well, then only those of us of British ancestry can speak English. Everyone else, you have to learn, you can, but again, it's just ridiculous. And sometimes in America, we have good intentions, but we take things so far. And like we're almost a bit sometimes sadistic, I think.
Yeah, well, I think we're getting a little off base because it's like a fun conversation. But I guess an example would be like Elvis. A lot of people think that that's cultural appropriation because he didn't give credit to where he got his style of music and dancing and stuff like that. He took it from a culture and kind of made it his own and profited greatly without giving credit for it. And I can see that argument. But if he, say, for example, like I said, with a Jeremy Lin and Kenyon Martin example, like where they're like, hey, no, I got this from this culture and I like it and it's cool. I don't see a problem with that. Like, that's just sharing.
I think that's fair.
That's just sharing. But if you're pretending to take it and like, oh, this is me, I made this up. Oh, that's actual plagiarism and theft, and that's actually illegal. But that's bad. That's appropriation. But when you're but it's gotten to the point where, oh, I like this. No, it's not for you. And
you're not allowed.
Yeah, and this actually leads in back to the classroom. So, what about myself? There's a Chinese term called 混血. I'm not saying it properly because my Chinese is terrible, but that means mixed blood. So I'm half Filipino and half white. That's the Chinese term for being a mixed blood. So how I got the kids to think creatively, I told them about my life. I told them about me and the things that I had to face, good things, bad things. I tell them I'm divorced, told them my mom died when I was young. I tell them a lot about my personal life so they can see like, oh my God, this is a person and he's talking to us about his ideas. So then hopefully they become comfortable with like, hey, maybe I can share some of the thoughts in my head. Because I don't, like, some of the teachers will say, oh, these Chinese kids just don't know how to be creative. I said, well, I don't know if that's true. They're just not allowed to express it. They're alone and thinking thoughts all the time. They're just not allowed to express them. So when I found by actually saying, hey, here's some bad things I did, or here's some mistakes I made with my life, they're not like, oh my God, because I'm not like, I'm the teacher and you are my minions and you must worship me. That's a whole nother thing about how some teachers are, not just China, I mean everywhere. Teachers, and a lot of them I don't like. Like growing up, I can count on one hand how many teachers I actually liked.
Oh wow.
I mean, you're with them all day, and you're like, oh, I gotta go to this class now. I mean, I have very few where I look back and like, that was an awesome person. And that ratio doesn't change when you're an adult. I see all these teachers who have become that person that no one wanted to be in their class, but they do it themselves. And they just carry on this horrible culture of like a domineering teacher who like, I want everything quiet in here, you better do what I say kind of mentality. So, so that kind of just goes back to the creativity thing. Is I talk to them a lot about my life and what it's like to be part of a mixed culture and living in different cultures, and how it changed my life and changed my mind. And doing that with these students made them think, oh wow, I can express my opinion comfortably here. I don't have to be worried that he's going to say, no, that's bad, you don't do that.
Right.
Yeah.
Because I do feel like the Chinese education system in general sort of, just, I don't know if I would say it actively discourages it or not, but I don't feel that it encourages it. And I think that's one thing a lot of us foreign teachers do try to do, is encourage that, it doesn't matter how, like if you're learning English, it doesn't matter how good your vocabulary is. It's not just how many words do you know, but yeah, can you express yourself, and here's an opportunity to do so. And some sort of do sort of adapt to that and flourish, and then others, I think, just struggle with it. Because I do think that is a big difference in our cultures is, in the West, for better or worse, we are more individualistic, and people, I think, are encouraged, maybe not in every context, but are given more opportunities, I think, to express themselves, usually than in China.
Absolutely, yes. I agree. I totally agree with that. Your reputation is so important here. I guess that might lead into something later, but there is this culture of embarrassment.
So, what were some things that surprised you when you first arrived? Maybe, your first week, your first month, your first few months. What things about Chinese culture and maybe the schools, the education surprised you?
All right, I'll see you. Well, it's hard to say, and it sounds dumb to say, but seeing all the signs, it sounds really dumb, but seeing all the signs with the Chinese characters and stuff was a little bit of a shock at first, because even though I had been to other countries and stuff, it was still in like the English alphabet, in Colombia and like Costa Rica and stuff like that. But in China, obviously, all the signs were in Chinese and stuff, for most of them. So that kind of struck me as weird. And some of the markets and stuff, like, I don't know, you'd see like squid and stuff like dangling, or like a cow chopped in half the long way or whatever. So
sure,
there's things like that I had never really seen before, and I guess that's mostly it. Nothing like jumped out too extremely besides that, but I remember being struck by the Chinese characters all over the place. I guess one thing that did sort of surprise me was the lights from above, because like when you're flying above like the United States, all the lights are sort of like pale yellow and stuff, but all of a sudden when I flew over Asia, the city lights were all like purple and greens and oranges and stuff like that.
Oh, okay.
That was kind of cool.
Yeah, they use a lot of colorful neon lights in China, no doubt.
Yeah, the cities are all new, it seems like.
Yeah.
So,
was there anything, so your first day or your first week in class, or just reflecting on the whole experience, what were some things maybe you noticed that maybe surprised you or were different about a Chinese classroom from an American or a Colombian classroom?
well, one of the main differences that I noticed, at least from public schools in the U.S., was in China, the parents gave a lot of support to the teachers and like really liked and sort of seemed to respect the teachers and respect me. And they were like very happy I was there and very happy that I was like helping to teach their kids and stuff. And so I felt like really well appreciated and almost respected and stuff. And that was a good feeling. It's different than being a substitute teacher.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it was mostly positive in that regard then.
Yeah, I'd say it was very positive.
So I want to get to so it's been a good chat so far. Now I want to get to three sort of components of the culture, and this is you've read it. This is what I've been covering in the written portion of this project. So three of the components of Chinese culture that I think are pretty significant are the concept of face, collectivism, which we've already gone into a little bit, and Confucianism. So would you be able to maybe define or describe those as you understand them? Face, collectivism, Confucianism. What do you think those are? How do you think they might manifest in the schools, influence the education system? What could you say about that?
Okay.
Maybe start with face, or you're up to you. Go ahead.
All right, face. Yeah, it's hard to. I know that face is a big one for China, and you could even say that the current pandemic, its roots, or it started because China didn't want to lose face. It didn't want to admit
Definitely
it had
Definitely.
problem, but they've lost a lot of face anyway. But in my daily
Yep.
life, it's hard to see how face actually manifested. Really, I mean, sometimes I don't know, meet
Well,
a
I
woman.
get this sense that with daily life, whether it's like a macro or micro scale, it's all about never swallowing your pride, never admitting you're wrong, never admitting you made a mistake. Like no accountability. It's always like finger pointing. If something goes wrong or someone dropped the ball or didn't carry through, there's always an excuse. It's always someone else's fault. Like there's no ownership, I feel. It's a lot of blaming other people and circumstances, which I kind of find childish, because when I was growing up, I think those were my childish impulses, but my family and society, I think, sort of, discouraged that behavior. And I started, learning, you know what, I need to be responsible. I need to take responsibility for my actions. I can't just blame people all the time. Sometimes things are my fault. And I feel like that's one difference between sort of my culture and Chinese culture.
Yeah, and it's also the sort of an amorphous practice of giving face as well, which is unclear. So it's hard to know exactly what giving face is or losing face is. It seems the interpretation can be quite flexible.
Yeah.
It really depends. But in my own life over there, I suppose people are giving me face. Like, for example, if I invited a girl out on a date and she didn't want to come, she would say, "Oh, maybe another time," instead of outright, honestly rejecting me. Although there have been rejections, but there's also been examples of that, sort of giving me face in that, And then I suppose being invited out for meals by Chinese,
Yeah.
I think it was on a basis of friendliness or they liked you, but actually by being with the Chinese, you gave them face because you're a Westerner.
Right.
Some sort
Right.
of
It's kind of selfish, actually. It's not as altruistic as it seems on the surface.
yeah, it's like a prestige is attached to
Yeah.
it. So this giving face can be, I don't really know. So face for me on the ground didn't really come into it, but it did later when I was going to get married to a Chinese girl, and she was talking about the money that had to be paid to the family and the big wedding ceremony that had to be paid for, and basically it's whatever the father asked for. So
Yeah.
she's saying it'd probably be around 100,000 RMB for a wedding, which is about, I think, about 12 or 13,000 American dollars. And I was like, well, I've spoken to some of your friends and they got married for, a third of the price. You just
Yeah.
hired out a restaurant. She said I could never do something like that on the cheap because my dad would lose face. It would dishonor my father. He'd want the whole village invited and free cigarettes handed out and dinners for everyone and their hotels paid for on my dollar, because it gives him face. So that was another thing. And also I couldn't compromise with them because they lost face that I'd even tried to compromise. So it was really messed up, strictured and unfair, to be honest. So that's how face came into my mind. But face for me is just a sort of general, unregulated prestige system, really. And it stops them from coming on. But and it's all related, of course, to all the others you said, Confucianism and what was the other one?
Collectivism.
Yeah, collectivism. So Confucianism to me just means about the fundamental of it is filial piety, and I think they've really got that in China.
So how would you define that filial piety?
Well, being obedient to your parents or serving your parents, almost like a contract, and the Chinese often say it, well, they looked after me when I grew up, and as they get older, it's, for me to pay them back. You know, it's
Yeah.
kind of like an honor system, like a symbiosis. They invest in you,
Yeah.
you back in them. But of course, traditionally, it's only meant to be the boy who's doing that. If they have a son, it's meant to be looking at him afterwards. But a lot of the time, women do. Like my ex in Sichuan, she was all about, you know, a lot of the money needs to go to my family. We need to pay back my father for, and all of this. So it's not just, it goes across the board with them, really. So, yeah, Confucianism, I think that it means there's a lot of discipline with kids so that they are always studying. The students or the kids never counter what their parents think or say early.
And
Taiwan.
do you think this carries over into the classroom with the relationship between students and teachers?
I think it does, but I think they undermine it a bit with a Westerner. I've had students being outright rude to me, and it's only because I'm a Westerner.
Yeah, I think like the rules don't necessarily apply to us, but I think if you go into a Chinese classroom with a Chinese teacher, the students tend to be dead silent. You know, it's just the teacher is the sage on the stage. Just it's all lecture based, and the students just sort of passively absorb knowledge and just accept information from an authority figure. They don't challenge or question or discuss or debate. They're just given information. They accept it as gospel. Maybe in some cases in their inner hearts or minds they don't, but they accept it on the basis of authority, and rarely is there any like just discussion about ideas or behavior. Would you agree with that? That's been my observation.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know enough Chinese to actually sit in their classrooms, but I think that is it, because that's how they act with us. You know, no one really counters what we say, unless it goes on to something Chinese.
Yeah, unless exactly. Yeah, that's a good point. And I think in a way too, that's it sort of ties in with face. I think it's a bit of both, the behavior in the classroom. One, I think they have this Confucian respect for authority, but at the same time, I think there's this also well, if we disagree with the teacher or we challenge or question the teacher loses face. So I think kind of both of those influence the behavior.
Yeah, it does. And so for someone to flagrantly disregard that, it must show an extreme disrespect. I had one English corner where I stood up before, and I said to him, "Well, you know, what is Chinese culture? Tell me, you know, its features." And then I asked, "What is Chinese modern culture?" And I remember this saying to me. He said, "Well, Chinese modern culture is like, do you know, opening up?" I think he's talking about this 1978 or 79 when Deng Xiaoping opened up. And I said, when China like made a semi adoption of a Western economic model. And I said semi, and he said, he like actually clicked his tongue and went, "We did not copy you. You always think we copy." And then he's talking in Chinese to his buddies. It's like, you know nothing. And it's like, we were the superpower 300 years ago, and we will be again. But it was said with menace and complete contempt to me. And actually, the joke was on him because I said semi-adoption. I never meant a full adoption. I just meant privatization. Of course, it's much more complicated when you've got a lot of state-owned factories and state-owned banks, and you know the government's got a finger in a lot of the pies. It's a bit like the way the Nazis were.
And the students,
anyway,
are Go ahead.
I actually told him that I said semi, and I got quite heated. He was just so rude to me, and it's just this nationalism is growing. A teacher being there, as traditionally is meant to be treated with respect. You don't make him lose face. You're meant to listen to him. But then I'm sure in their Marxist classes and on their television, and you know the the West, especially America, is the demon, and then you're placing him up on a podium to teach. So there's a rift here in what's happening, you know, what you meant to listen to, if that's the very arch enemy or someone from the arch enemy's country.
That's interesting. And yeah, they are hyper nationalistic, and like we almost touched on earlier, most of the time they won't disagree with what a teacher says, but yeah, if a foreign teacher says anything critical of China, anything at all, or anything contrary to some of the propaganda, like, then you might encounter some resistance. I do find, they're very sensitive about certain things, very nationalistic, and kind of the inverse of what's going on in our countries. Like in the West, I kind of joke with some friends and say, in America, it's like you almost can't say anything good about America. We're always bashing ourselves and, talking about all the bad things in history and like self-flagellating. And just can admit no good. It's almost like we love to air our dirty laundry and roll around and repent. And then in China, it's like the opposite. It's like all the horrendous things they've done in history are swept under the rug, excluded from official history books. People don't like to talk about it. And it's just like, it's so interesting. Like they're almost like polar opposites in that respect. Would you agree?
Yeah, they are. I mean, at university, when I did my bachelor study, it was all about sort of how guilty Britain has been, basically, from having an empire, and how polluted our literature is with this sense of colonialism and white supremacy. It was all about othering, instances.
And see, with China, they do have a genuine sense, in my opinion, of Chinese supremacy, but there's no guilt or apology for it. It's like, well, of course we're supreme. We're the best. Like sometimes I get that sense. And again, it's just so different from the West, from our own homelands.
And I like, it's quite funny how when they do concede that there are problems, when they say, oh, well, people spit, or, some people are in poverty zone. They say, but we are a developing country. But at the same time, they believe they're preeminent and superior, but they always apologize for what is, obtrusive and undeniable by saying we're a developing country. But at the same time.
Yeah, they use that a lot as a cop-out, yeah.
Yeah, they do. But, I mean, it's something admirable in that they're progress-minded. They're all looking to the future.
Yeah.
But do they have any choice in being progress-minded? You got to, they're all structured. They're all forced into these positions. It's just their lives are properly mapped out. I actually made them do a life plan in class, and it was just, again, all the same. It was graduate from university, find a job, find a wife, get married. And for the women, and I say this is good for the women, well, when you look at the West, where less women are getting married or want to be traditional housewives. A lot of the Chinese women, even though they're doing master's degrees, or they were all about one day finding a husband and getting married. This is still etched on the mind that they want to fill the traditional role. But I wonder if they can. As the economic pressure rises, whether they'll be able to stay at home and look after a kid as the husband works. But definitely the pressure is all on the man in China, to pay.
Yeah, a lot of pressure on the man. And again, I think that ties in a little bit with the collectivism. Like you said, when you have them do life plans, you got very, very similar or identical responses. And I think if you went to, again, London or Los Angeles or wherever, and you did it, in American high school, you would have some people who go with the traditional route, and there's nothing wrong with that. A lot of people want to go to college. A lot of people want to get married. And I totally get that. But I still think there would be more variety in a Western classroom. There'd be more individuality, and people would talk about different vocations, and people might say, well, I want to maybe not really emphasize college and family, but more like specific goals, like well, I want to, travel to these countries, or I want to excel in these hobbies, or I feel like it would be more interesting and less generic. I feel like China is very, very cookie cutter, and there's just a lot more variety in the West, more individuality.
Yeah, well, there is, but at the same time, we've got similar processes going on, haven't we? Where these youngsters, these with political correctness, are all voicing the same stuff, and they can't even back up information. It's so specious what they're saying. It's conceptual. Of course, we don't want racism. We want Black lives to matter. We don't want to see blacks killed on the street by racist policemen.
Right.
Of course, you'd be quite evil just for no reason to have black people killed. But then back it up by evidence. Well, is that happening all the time? And more whites are being killed by the police, unarmed and armed. More violence is visited upon whites, but they've taken on this thought process and these slogans and this.
Well, I think when you stir up a mob and have them chanting slogans, sometimes the thinking doesn't go too far. But I just find that it can happen and has happened in Western countries. And yeah, some might argue it's happening now. I'll leave that up for other people to decide. But I think it's just more common in China. I would feel like almost day to day, it's always just these slogans, and there's no explanation behind it, or there's no data, or if you challenge the slogan and say, well, what's that based upon, you don't really get much.
Yeah, exactly. We talked about that as well. You don't get much when we talk about their hobbies or what they did at the weekend. And it just seems to me that Chinese people, even just by the look of them, the students, is that they're so disimpassioned. There's no passion that impels them to sort of elaborate on something or to go into more detail.
Right. It does feel like they're just going through the motions a lot, kind of robotic. So now we're going to get into some stuff that maybe is a bit more broad or abstract or academic, and different people have different maybe levels of knowledge of some of this stuff. So just, again, elaborate as much as you can. I realize not everyone's a Confucian scholar, including myself, but doing my research, I was trying to think of, what are three, major aspects or components of Chinese culture, like especially ones that might influence like education. And, three of the ones that came to my mind that I decided to focus on for the written component of this project are face. I think they have a big face culture in China, collectivism versus, individualism in the U.S., and then Confucianism, which I think is sort of a foundation for a lot of their thinking and habits and hierarchy versus in the, Western culture. We have, the Greco-Roman tradition and Socrates and the Judeo-Christian tradition. And I think that underlines a lot of our traditions and thinking. So let me ask you, though, how would you define face? What is your understanding of this idea of face? If somebody from America were to ask you, what does it mean, face in China? What would you say? How would you describe it?
Yeah, so whenever I was first introduced to this term, I really did not have any kind of idea about it. I didn't know how to define. Actually, I really had I had no idea what it was, even once I learned about it. Like when they said it's kind of more or less like bringing shame or trying to avoid from bringing shame on yourself or your family or anything like that. Really trying to avoid admitting that you're wrong. Kind of like being too proud of a situation to even let the bad things occur. That's just kind of my little description about it. But when I first saw it in action, I thought, oh, okay, this is how it's going to be. It really does. I hate to put this in a bad way, but it kind of loses faith in humanity because from what I've seen, it doesn't matter how bad something happens. They are more than willing to save face than try to reconcile any kind of situation. And from my understanding, reconciliation is probably one of the cornerstones of humanity progressing. Because human behavior is never going to agree on everything, and we're always going to make bad decisions, and there's always going to be problems, and there's always going to be conflicts. So how do we deal with these conflicts? And trying to save face, in my opinion, is probably one of the worst. I wouldn't even call it a solution, but for them, that's a solution.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think you nailed it, especially when you said just like a refusal to admit any wrongdoing. And I feel like that is so different from the West, because I feel like we're often encouraged, especially as young people, to, you know, admit when you're wrong, be responsible for your actions, don't make excuses, don't blame other people. You know, that's kind of how I grew up. That's my perception. And, you know, and again, I remember there were always these like sayings or Bible verses about, you know, too much pride can kill a man. Pride comes before a fall. And I feel like, you know, we still have this in our culture to an extent. People care about image, reputation. You know, sometimes people, don't want to admit fault. But I feel like in the West, we're a lot more willing to admit fault, either as an individual or as a society, especially if you look right now with people maybe tearing down statues. I guess it depends how far you want to go into it. But I feel like in the West, especially the States, we're sort of hypercritical. And sometimes I think we go a bit too far, but I do think we do criticize ourselves in our society. And I feel like in China, it's almost the opposite. They want to avoid any criticism of themselves, their society. And it always feels like, the most important thing in any situation is to save face for oneself, one's family, one's culture. Never admit any wrongdoing, never admit any fault. If someone, I think, is confronted, they often try to make excuses or blame someone else. And I've thought, you know, if that were to happen in the States, people would view it as childish. That's sort of how I look at it.
Right, yeah. So I definitely think that our culture is built on everyone having a civic duty to one another, having a strong social contract where we think about our neighbors, even though we are individualistic in so many ways. We try our best to do what's right. Now, someone can argue that, a lot of this does come from the biblical teachings. But I also think that, you know, from a secularist point of view, people are genuinely this way. Like, I don't think that evolution has really got here for people trying to save face. You know, I think humans really do have an innate ability of having empathy and compassion, and for the times that we do wrong and we have to admit it. Sure, it's not an easy thing, but like I said, I think that's one of the solutions of moving past problems, not holding grudges, and being able to find out, I don't know, how the future can be after handling these kind of situations. Here, I think that it's the opposite. You know, where grudges are held indefinitely, and I don't know. I just feel like, for one example that I would use is in my school, we knew one of the teachers quit, and I know why he quit. He wasn't getting paid enough money, and we asked my boss. We said, "Hey, where's Chun?" His name is Chun. Where's Chun?
Sorry. Could you repeat that? No. Why did he quit? It broke off for a second. Why did he quit?
He wasn't getting paid enough money. the salary was
okay.
very low for him, and he was a very hard worker. He definitely deserved more.
Was he Chinese?
So
Was he Chinese?
yeah,
Or
local.
American? Okay.
He was Chinese. And we asked my boss. I said, "Where's Chun? Haven't seen Chun around. Where's Chun?" And her response was, "Oh, he's sick. He's sick. He's sick." And even though we all have his WeChat, he was posting pictures and stuff like that. And we told my boss, we're like, "Listen, we know he's not sick. You can be honest with us." They're afraid to say these things, and versus our culture, in business, if someone quit, they quit. They moved on to other opportunities. Or maybe they were a disgruntled employee about something. I don't know. I feel like that example really did fit the description of how people try to save themselves from any kind of disrespect or whatever. But I've seen this issue of several other times. I mean, for the majority of my life is pretty condensed. I don't really go out too much and speak to a lot of people, so a lot of my frame of reference is very limited. But I would say that's one of the ones that really stuck out to my mind.
Okay, yeah, and I think if you talk to anybody who's lived in China for a year or two, they can come up with a few examples. But yeah, that's good. Let's go to the next one now. So collectivism. I think I already know how you'll answer this, but do you think China is a collectivist culture or an individualistic culture?
Yeah, so obviously collectivist culture, and in my personal opinion, I do favor a lot of these characteristics, social characteristics.
Okay, can you elaborate on that a bit? Like, how do you think China's collective compared to the U.S.? Like, what do you see, or what have you experienced or observed that's led you to that conclusion? How do you think it's different? What do you think are maybe the positive aspects, etc.?
So I've noticed that if something, I shouldn't say if something bad happens, because I know that it's very common for something bad to happen and for locals to not do anything. They just take out their cell phones and start recording instead of actually being of some use or value. But I will say that if there's any kind of disaster, something that's out of everyone's control, they will all band together and make things livable conditions. So I guess one specific issue is when it snows here. Sometimes we get a lot of snow, and I've seen videos from all different areas where locals get out there and they clear roads, they clear pedestrian areas, they clear so many things for the overall good of their community. This is something that we do not see in our country, or where I'm from. I would say that if something like this were to happen, people would wait for city workers to come out and get it taken care of. Now, to our argument, that's kind of what their job is, to be a public utility. But
Right. I
I guess considering if they don't really have that here, what else do they have? They have themselves. So I think that I like how they are more than willing to come together for a common cause. This is something that I do think that we could adopt in our society, especially during times like this where maybe there's a feeling that a certain type of group of people are against another type of group of people, or I think that this really is helpful of their collectivist nature.
Now, to react to that, I think, again, one of the major differences between China and the United States is, I'm sure you'll agree, everybody in America, one of the popular words these days is diversity everywhere. Whereas in China, I think they talk more, or they may not say it, but I think they are less interested in diversity for its own sake, and they're more interested in unity and stability.
Oh, absolutely. They could care less about diversity. I don't even think they want diversity. They are very comfortable with telling everyone that they are Chinese. They are proud to be themselves. They don't want to be inclusive. They don't have any desire for diversity. I've actually heard stories where a foreigner would marry a local. They would have a baby, and once that baby gets to about 6, 7 years old, there are characteristics where they can distinguish that, like, they are not pure Han blood, and and a lot of locals really do reject that child simply because they have mixed race DNA, and this is a very prominent thing. I mean, if let's say if a woman has a baby with a foreigner for some reason, let's say she has to move back home. Let's say they have it in another country. They move back home, and then she wants to find love. Like, they have to get a divorce, whatever the situation may be. A Chinese man, it will never accept another baby from another man, like to take care of another baby from another man, or more than that, a foreign baby. That's almost like a disgrace to them. So I feel like they do not care anything about diversity. At face value, it may look like it, but no, that is not true.
Right. And yeah, good points. Whereas, I think Americans are a bit more altruistic in that, for example, lots of American couples have adopted Chinese babies, for example. And I think there is, a big difference in our character and their character, especially in that respect. And again, I think whether a person is secular or religious, I do think some of these sort of sentiments or notions or values we have do come from some of our religious heritage. So even a lot of secular people I know in America will have, maybe they don't believe in God or go to church, but they still might have quote unquote Christian values. And I won't necessarily find those in China. And I think that's kind of interesting, and one major difference. But I want to ask you again on the subject of collectivism. I think one of the big differences also is just in terms of thought and thinking. In America, we have, different political parties, different ideas. We have, mundane things like if a movie's good or not, to things like, religion or especially politics. And we have a lot of different opinions and diversity in thinking, whereas I feel like in China, the majority are on the same page ideologically, and there's a lot of similarity and uniformity in their thought. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. There's really not so much disagreement about these bigger issues that you mentioned. I can't say that it's true. Like, I believe that a lot of people do have disagreements, but they don't really discuss them. They don't really they're not open about what they feel. Now, maybe that's not true. It's just my lack of understanding. Whenever I do see people talking, people try to include me as much as they can, even though I don't really speak a lot of Chinese. But I think, especially when it comes to politics, everyone is in agreement or in agreement in public, I should say. Now, I can't say that they are willing to discuss them face to face with another person, but if they know that another person is neutral in a way, like such as myself, they will tell me, they will say, our country is not heading in the direction that we want to. But I doubt that they will say that to another local person, because they know that there could be some implications involved. And I guess the area that I live in is real big in government. I live in a community full of government officials and stuff. So I do feel that there is a bit more pressure whenever they do talk about these type of things, or at least where I'm at. But yeah, the mindset of collectivism, and it's true that they don't really expand on too much of different types of thought. Their thought process is kind of, I shouldn't say linear, but it's definitely congruent with everyone else's. Whether that would be, you could even look at their style of fashion, and it all looks the same. Doesn't seem like there's any real free expression of anything. So I feel like their thought process is really ingrained into their culture. It has nothing to do with individualism at all. In my opinion, this is my opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think, again, conformity and uniformity are valued there versus individuality, freedom of expression, creativity, different ways of thinking. And I have heard it said before, I don't remember where, but I think, in China it was described as linear thinking, where I think in the West or in America we're more willing to engage in lateral thinking, maybe color outside the lines, where sometimes in China they seem very narrow-minded almost, and just only sort of one way of seeing the world, and it's the Han way or the highway. Whereas I like to think in the West, not everybody, but people in general are more receptive to hearing different ideas, to trying different things, to try to be somewhat tolerant of people of, different backgrounds or different opinions. I mean, sometimes people end up arguing, but I do think we have a lot more, and I think when you look at Western culture, United States, you do see so much creativity and innovation, and like, look at our popular culture. It's exported all over the world. People like American fashion, people like American music, people like American movies, like the Marvel comic book movies are really popular in China. And I think that's partially because of our thinking, our creativity, our originality, our innovation. And I don't really see that from China so much. And I think, again, this has to do with thought patterns, culture, and education, basically.
Yeah, I would agree to everything. I would agree to all of that. Absolutely.
Now, the next one, it's a bit tricky because we're not all Confucian scholars. I've lived in China several years. I've read about Confucius and the Analects, and I feel like I have a basic idea, but I definitely wouldn't consider myself an expert. But there is a lot of information about him online, and I've never found him that interesting. I think the Western philosophers, whether it's Plato or Nietzsche, are a lot more interesting and thought-provoking than Confucius. But if somebody wants to understand Chinese culture, it's necessary to I think, have some familiarity with Confucius, because he is such an important part of the culture. What do you know about Confucianism? What is your ideas about it? What do you know about it? Again, how do you think it manifests or influences the culture or the education? What's your take?
Well, I guess I've visited, my first really exposure to Confucius was in Vietnam. I saw that there was a Confucius school, or the first Confucius school. I'm not sure what the significant was, but that inspired me to just kind of think about who this person was, and the only thing that I could really drill down into is that he's very strong on authority. from what I know, I could be completely wrong on this. From what I understand, there is a hierarchy in place. It's very male-driven, and it's either there's either like a right or wrong type mentality, from what I understand. I don't really I've never really looked into his teachings or the details of Confucianism, but I do know that there is a widespread criticism about these Confucius schools that are popping up all over global universities.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I would say that universities are I would say a bedrock for debating ideas. They will allow some of the worst ideas to be discussed. So if they have an issue with Confucianism being taught in their schools, then that tells me that there is a problem with how data material analysis are being really transferred. Like I don't know too much about it, but I can't say that universities are just being anti-China. No, I don't think that's the right way to describe the issue.
Well, you're referring, I think, to the Confucian Institutes, and I think Sweden was the first or one of the first to ban it. But I don't think it really has anything to do with Confucius or Confucianism. I think it's just more they look at it as Chinese propaganda, and trying to portray a false image of China and Chinese history. I think they would pay a lot of lip service to Confucius, but again, I kind of understand the rationale behind banning these, because I think they're worried about it's because you could go to a university and take, most universities would have Chinese history courses or Eastern philosophy. So it's not like Confucianism is banned. I think it's just a lack of mistrust with, the CCP being involved in Western education, because they tend to, I think, whitewash things a lot more. I think in America, again, for example, we love to air our dirty laundry and self-flagellate and talk about this, you know what I mean? Talk about the sins of our past and just roll around and wallow in every, it's almost like, again, opposite. I believe that in America, a lot of people, we really underemphasize all our achievements. I mean, we're like the first country to go to the moon. And if I'm not mistaken,
we are humble in some ways.
Yeah, and we don't. And we have the most Olympic medals, I think, like in history. We usually come out, and a lot of us, we don't take any pride in that, or we just ignore that, or just go, yeah, that's nice, but let's talk about all the bad things. And like, we love that. We love this hyper criticism. But again, in China, it's like, no, we've never done anything wrong. Like, we're awesome.
I would like to add it. Yeah, I would like to add an anecdote to that. One of the parents of my students, I've become good friends with him, and they wanted to purchase a book about the war between China and Taiwan, or whatever that situation whatever happened. There was a special book that's not sold in China mainland, but is sold in Taiwan. So they gave me the great task of going and purchasing that book and bringing it back to them. And they understand that, they do kind of, like you say, whitewash things, but it's almost like they don't want to they don't want to put value in it. Like for us, if someone tries to whitewash history, we raise the most noise about it. We really do take value about truth and honesty. This is what we try to do. But it seems like Chinese culture, it's just more
image,
like
it's reputation.
Right.
And again, this reminds me again of another old saying I grew up with as a kid. don't judge a book by its cover. Appearances can be deceiving. It's what's on the inside that counts. We have all these little phrases and expressions, and I feel like in China it's the opposite. It's like, no, it is about, the cover of the book. It's not about the content. If it's a beautiful golden cover and it makes you look smart, that's all that matters. And truth is really just not given a lot of priority in China, in my opinion. And again, I think this is another sort of difference, just maybe in like their philosophies. Again, with Confucius, whenever I've read about him or studied him, he seemed like a very practical philosopher. Like, he was very grounded, I think, in like the material world and relationships and society and authority, hierarchy, and just how can we have a harmonious society. Whereas I think, again, in the West, you look at Socrates or Plato or like some of these ancient philosophers, and there is a lot of questioning about, well, more abstract. What is truth? What is virtue? What is knowledge? Epistemology. How do we know if something is true? What does it mean to be good? And I feel like with the West, there's a lot more sort of abstract, metaphysical thinking. And I feel like in China, again, it's a lot more just practical. Go ahead.
I don't think that they really recognized the Age of Enlightenment either. I think their studies come from such a long time ago that they just don't really take part into what the world has discovered throughout time. This is what I think.
Okay. So maybe that would be a difference in education, maybe.
Well, no, I think you were hitting on all the points where it is, some of it is kind of metaphysical. Like I say, a lot of it does have to do with epistemology and a lot of the Greek philosophers that really brought the thought process into the Enlightenment period, where we really saw a lot of advancement through society, where we actually put pen to paper instead of just kind of letting it go through the wheelhouse, or I don't know how to explain it. But yeah, I think you're completely right on all that.
Okay, we're back. So you were getting ready. I cut you off. You're getting ready to talk about culture of embarrassment, reputation. So the next thing I have ready to ask, and this is part of the written component of this project I'm doing. When I was thinking about China, I thought, okay, what are three sort of big major components of Chinese culture? And the three I came up with were face, collectivism, and Confucianism. And I think where you're heading is kind of on the topic of face. So if you want to just continue and then explain what you think face is and how this relates to what you're getting ready to say, I just wanted to kind of preface that. But now I'll hand it over to you. So what is face? What were you going to say about reputation, embarrassment, all that? Go for it.
Okay. So we have the expression in the West, he's just trying to save face. We say that in a way like to avoid embarrassment, like something went wrong and now you're trying to make it look less bad. Here, when you do something incorrect, their public shaming is normal, right? Before I go to the students, I'll go back to teaching. I was observing this camp one time. It's not the one that we were at, but they, some employees were late and to a meeting. So the boss made each of them go up individually in front of the whole room and explain why they were late. They had to bow down with their heads down and like solemnly explain why they were late. And then the person just berated them in front of everybody and like told them they're going to get fired if they do this again, and just try to ridicule them in front of everybody. Yeah, and that was really like, oh man. So when I talked to so I witnessed that myself, like, man, that's not cool. That was really uncomfortable. I don't know how much that helps, really. We'll see. But so at the schools I was working at, I told some people about that, and they're like, oh, you don't see what we see because you're a foreign teacher and they treat you very nicely and kindly. But how we get treated, if we do something wrong, they make everyone know about it, and that's how they prevent. That's how they think they're inspiring you to not make a mistake again, is by embarrassing you so much in front of everybody that you will not do it again. So that makes going back to the classroom, I assume that happens at every level of your life, right? So when it goes back to the classroom, you're going to be terrified to express yourself or say something, and if someone says that you're wrong and embarrasses you in front of everyone, that's going to be so scary to actually, show yourself ever.
Right. Yeah. I think that's a pretty interesting way of thinking about it. I definitely think of it as being embarrassment and just this concern about reputation and not looking like in a classroom setting, not looking foolish or unprepared, and they really. I was telling another guy I was talking with earlier, like when I think of the West, I feel like at least I grew up, and I think a lot of people did, with these ideas about first of all, practice makes perfect. If you're learning something, you're going to make mistakes along the way, and it's the journey, not the destination. And I think that's part of our culture. I also think we have all these sayings about sometimes like swallow your pride, or pride comes before a fall, and we discourage, I think, or at least we try to discourage either having too much pride or also being afraid of making mistakes. There's a famous Michael Jordan quote about how many games he's lost and how many shots he's missed, and as a result, that's why he's successful. And I feel like that's kind of embedded in the Western psyche. But yeah, I feel like in China they're so concerned with their image and their reputation, and so worried about making a mistake or embarrassing themselves that they will do sort of anything to avoid that. And a lot of people are saying that's sort of how this coronavirus pandemic started to spread, is the government wanted to save face, so they tried to deny it and suppress it, and they were silencing the whistleblower doctors, and then they started saying, oh, America imported it to Wuhan, and then they tried to blame Italy and pointing fingers at everybody else. And I feel like that's a very Chinese thing, is always sort of deflect blame, and I guess it can manifest in different ways. Again, I'm sort of rambling, but does any of that resonate, or do you feel the same way? Do you feel differently about anything I said?
No, I would say that's pretty much what happened. And so when I talk to other people here, they really do believe that. Recently I talked to someone about what's happening in America with the virus now, and how I was getting treated here as a foreigner. People were treating me very poorly. We can come back to that later, the experience I had with that. But I was explaining that to them, and she was like, well, that's what you get because your country did this. And I was like, what? But the virus started here in China. And she's like,
right.
But then she said, what makes you think it started in China? And I was like, because I've been here. Yeah, I haven't left for 2 years. And she's like, well, we're pretty sure that it came from America. And I was like, oh, okay. That's when I realized
ridiculous. Yeah,
there's no point in talking to you anymore,
right.
Because that's just, you already have absolved. I mean, not her as a person, as a country, have absolved yourself of any responsibility. It's like didn't even start here. So it started in America, and now America's getting what they get because that's what they get for trying to bring it here. And oh man, that's sad. But yeah, like there was a person here in my city during the outbreak that supposedly broke protocol for where he traveled, and then he came back and didn't tell anybody properly, and then he actually had the virus and spread it to a few people here, and they posted his photo all over social media, like, this guy did this and he should be shamed.
Wow.
Supposedly the government released it. I don't know if that's true, because again, this is hearsay, but this was going around everywhere that this person did this, and I was like, man, That's not cool he did that. It's also kind of crazy to publicly shame him, like in the same way that I told you those employees were being shamed. This person is like, okay, everyone, look what this person did. Let's all shame him.
Right.
So yeah, it's a very strange thing. What you said about American culture, I think applies to me and you, but today it's a little different. Like this, I'm sure you've heard the phrase cancel culture.
Oh
Right?
yeah. Oh yeah.
So this shaming of anything or anything you've ever done bad has become so rampant in America now. I would also be afraid to say anything ever because of 5 years from now or out of context, I'm gonna have my life ruined because I said something bad.
Right.
So yeah, that shaming thing, for me and you, for growing up, because we're in our 30s, I believe, like we
Well,
had.
I used to be in my 30s, but
Okay.
recently, yeah. But
Okay,
yeah,
I'm 37, so we're close in age. Okay,
we are.
yeah, so we grew up at a time where it's like, okay, it's all right to make mistakes and you can learn from them and grow. Whereas now it seems like, oh, you made a mistake 10 years ago, your life is over.
Destroy him.
Yes, yeah. So it's, yeah. So I try to be critical of America because I love America and I want it to improve. And there's many bad things and good things about it. But yeah, bringing it back to China is they don't want to be critical about themselves at all.
Right, right. And I feel like this might have something to do with, again, I think self-criticism is important, and maybe I think there might be something to this though, but I feel like, China, they love to boast that we're 5,000 years of history and culture.
Mhm.
And I think, great, how old is America? Not even 1,000 years old, not even 500 years old. And I think, but look at all the innovations and technological technology that America in its short history. And again, we're standing sometimes on the shoulders of giants, and we've inherited things from Europe and stuff. I get all that, but America put a man on the moon before anybody. When you look at Olympics, America's usually number one. And I think if you look at all the medals in the total history, America's got like the most gold medals. And that's in such a short history. And then again, China's got this long history, but they just sort of, so many things that they've just adapted or appropriated or imported from Western culture. And I think it's because, if you're very, very collective, very, very uniform, you don't like to criticize, you don't like to try different things, you might not progress. Whereas, again, in America, I think we do, at least maybe not as much recently, but we do welcome different ideas, and we do have, freedom of speech, freedom to try. And I think that because of ideology, America has done so many amazing things in such a short history, whereas China, I don't know. I mean, again, they have done some good things in their history, but I feel like so much of the modern world has come from U.S. innovation.
Yeah, absolutely. Like Chinese technology, when we talk about 5,000 years ago to 1,000 or 500, there's been some amazing things that have happened in China that have gone westward that kind of made Europe become better as well. But for the modern world, I was talking to the same person who was saying that the virus happened in America. I was talking to her about Chinese culture. She was telling me about, well, Chinese culture this, Chinese culture that. And I was like, well, what is Chinese culture? Because if you look at the way you're dressed and the government type and even your military uniforms, like, this is all Western stuff,
Right, right.
So what the pressure that you're putting on yourself to be Chinese, a lot of these ideas are not even Chinese. Like, I love Taoism, but no one here wants to be Taoist anymore.
Right,
Like,
right.
yeah, Chinese culture is very interesting in that way, that there's this rich, long history that they romanticize and they really like, but a lot of the modern world, their wants and desires and structure, come from, like, modern thought. That a lot of it came from the West. So to go back to how they kind of mix this with the past, I guess we can kind of segue that into Confucianism.
Yeah, we could either do collectivism or Confucianism. Just whatever you want to say about it. Like, just what is your start with either one. Choose one. Confucianism, collectivism. Sort of what's your understanding of that, and how do you think it sort of manifests in China's culture and schools?
Yeah. So when I think about the marrying of Confucianism to modern politics, the reason why it works well is because of collectivism. I mean, so trying to marry that all together. So my basic understanding of Confucianism, the 1-minute version, is that your personal relationships is a microcosm for society as a whole. Right? So there's this thing called the 5 relationships, right? Where how you should act with your friends, how you should act with your brother, how you should act with your parents, how you should act with your spouse. And then if everyone does that correctly, the relationship between the citizen and the government should be very harmonious. Because if each person individually is doing this properly, then everything should be harmonious. Right,
and they use that phrase a lot, harmonious society.
Yeah, and so within that, this is a Japanese phrase, but it applies here. The nail that stands out gets hammered down.
Right.
So there's this idea that collectivism is where you are part of a unit. So your individual, I'm not saying individuals don't matter, but the group matters way more than you.
Yes.
So.
Yes.
And you have a responsibility in that group to perform your certain duties or function to make sure, as a whole, the machine operates well. So by having these Confucian ideals where you are part of this group, and in this group, this is your job, and you have to do this thing, otherwise, you get shamed. And so working that into a communist view, which is kind of strange because the economy here is not very communist anymore, but that's another conversation. But the idea, whatever, traditionally or culturally communist, it fits well, I think, with Confucianism.
What is your understanding? I'm sure you encountered, most people encounter in China, this whole concept of face, and gaining face and saving face and losing face, and it's a really big part of Chinese culture. What's sort of your understanding about that? Did you have any experiences with that, or did it ever come up in conversation, or just what do you know about this concept of face?
Yeah, it rarely came up in conversation, and you're right, it is extremely important in terms of Chinese culture. Most important to know for laymen or whatever, if they don't know, is it's most important to never ever embarrass a host, or especially a guy in China. And so if someone says something you disagree with or something, then just don't make a big deal out of it. And I think that's one mistake I definitely made at first when I went to China. I didn't do it with a guy, luckily, but I remember some of the girls I was around and stuff, I'd be eating, I don't know, squid or something, and I'd spit a fish bone out or something, and I thought I was doing it like they were, and they would look at me and point and stuff like that. And that kind of annoyed me. And then it was my first or second week there, and they kept doing it. Oh, look at Edward. And then I was like, God, don't point at me like I'm a little monkey or something. And that was definitely a mistake on my part.
They do that a lot though in China, and sometimes it gets on my nerves a bit. That's something I would tell new teachers. If you go to China and you're not Chinese, especially if you look like probably you or me, you get a lot of unwanted attention. You get stared at, you get pointed at, people will take your photo, and it's nonstop sometimes.
Yeah, that's some advice I'd give to myself and also to anyone else going to China is, you have to just learn to not take yourself so seriously. If someone's going to point at you and laugh or something, I think it's better to just go along and laugh along with it and say, okay, it's just how I eat or whatever. But instead I was like, God, don't point at me. And it made it a lot worse. So I would give advice to new people going to China: don't take yourself so seriously, and most of all, don't embarrass anyone.
Yeah, it's good advice.
I mean, you could like tease and play with people, but like don't be serious and actually embarrass anyone.
Sure.
That's one of the important things, I think.
So would you say, I think this is an easy one, but would you say China's a individualistic culture or a collectivistic culture?
Yeah, I would say it's collectivistic, and that it's sort of all for the same good. That's sort of another thing I found a little bit surprising is that one example is like a friend of mine, someone who worked at the school, like married someone, and they like really didn't like their husband or something that much, and I was like, well, maybe you should get divorced or something. Like, oh no, I could never do that. My family would be really upset with that if I did that. Whereas like for most Americans, if you married someone and you didn't like them, but your family did, you would be tempted to get divorced. But in China, they're like, no, I could never do that to my family. Mm-hmm. And I found that a little odd, but that is how it is there. The group is kind of more important than the individual. Yeah,
definitely. Now, did you ever get the sense that maybe
that's related to
Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe that's a little bit related to the saving face and stuff. That like, if somebody does something that annoys you, then you just have to sort of go along with it and keep the harmony among the group.
Yeah,
it's more important than your own feelings.
And social harmony and harmonious society are phrases that from my experience, come up kind of often. People always say harmonious society.
They come up pretty often, and it's like I read in the news and stuff, and they're like, oh, well, we have to like keep dissent and protests and stuff like that down because we're a peaceful and harmonious society. And like, I thought that was all like lip service, and it sort of was, but actually from living in China and like walking around parks at night, it actually was pretty harmonious and peaceful. I'm like, this is actually pretty nice. So
it is safe. It is.
There's some sort of truth to it, where they actually are trying to maintain a peaceful and harmonious society, and it's kind of nice. They don't have like gangs running around at night or anything like that. So there's actually a good element.
Hello, I think I lost you. Oh, there you are.
Yeah.
Okay. I think it dropped for like 2 seconds. All right, good.
Mm-hmm.
I also think, and a lot of people bring that up with like, in terms of the family unit and being part of a nation and a family and all that. But I also think they're very compared to like Americans, for example, they're very collective in like thought and ideology and things like that. They have a lot in common with like their thinking and slogans, from my experience, versus America. You'll have, different groups and more people more willing to disagree, publicly. Yeah. But I found a lot in China. If I would ask questions to students, sometimes I would get identical or very similar responses. Did you have any experiences like that?
Yeah, I did. I would get a little bit sort of almost annoyed because I would get the same response, and I don't know if I can think of an example, but I would get sort of the same response. Like I would say like, oh yeah, I was reading about like the Song Dynasty. You know about them? And then someone would be like, oh yeah, we're very proud of the Song Dynasty. China has a long 5,000-year history, and I was like, yeah, they like invented this steel and stuff. And I'm like, they invented cannons and stuff, and I'd try to go into like specifics, and then they'd be like, no cannons, but we have 5,000 years of history. I'm like, yeah, I know you have 5,000 years of history, but do you know anything else about the Song Dynasty? And they're like, no, but we have a long continuous history in China. And then I'd like go to someone else and I'd be like, hey, have you ever heard about the Song Dynasty? And they're like, yeah, we have a 5,000 year history in China. I'm like, God, I know you.
Yeah.
Go to like a third person. I'm like, hey, have you ever heard about like the Song Dynasty or Southern Song Dynasty? Yeah, 5,000 years of history. It's like,
Yeah.
God, you guys like told to remember like the same phrase.
Right. They have like these stock sort of phrases and slogans that they sort of pull from their bag. And yeah, as an American or a teacher, it can be kind of frustrating sometimes, or just kind of dull. And obviously, you know, politics in China, it's kind of taboo. You can't really talk about it a whole lot. But as an example, I think you'll agree, you know, you could be almost anywhere in America. You could be in a very liberal or a very conservative place or school. But if you were to ask students, or if you were to go around America and do a poll or whatever and say, what do you think of the current president, whether it's Trump or Obama or Bush or Clinton? Some people are going to support. Some people are going to say, I don't like the president. You're going to get a range. And then some people might be like, well, I'm indifferent. I don't really care who's president. You might get some sort of range. Whereas in China, everybody's going to say, oh, I love the president. He's great. He's glorious, wonderful, dear leader.
He pays for his own lunch with his own money. He buys his own one.
But would you agree with that? Like there would be, again, like just sort of a uniformity in response. And
I've never heard a Chinese person say they don't like their president.
Right. And in America, no matter who is president, and I think it's good in a way that not everybody's, you know, and I suspect that some people don't like the Chinese leadership, but they're just not going to say it publicly. But I do think, you know, school students, younger ones, they're going to be more sincere, and they're going to be less maybe cynical than maybe an older person.
Yeah.
But yeah, I throughout my time in China, I've been going there off and on since 2003. So I've spent quite a bit of time there and in different cities. I would so often, not always, sometimes you have an anomaly or someone stands out, but very often get very, very similar responses. You know, again, there are exceptions, but in general, that does seem to be the norm. So that's face, that's collectivism. What do you know about Confucianism? I realize not everyone who goes to China for a year or two becomes a Confucian scholar, but do you know anything about it? Do you ever read about it? Do you know what it's all about?
Yeah, well, it's sort of one of those things that people can have their own different takes on it. So like, hold on. So yeah, about Confucianism. I have read a little bit about that. I know a little bit about that. I know some of his quotes, things like everything has its beauty, but not everyone sees it. That's one of his favorite. One of his quotes is a favorite. But I think it's sort of like one of those things that, like, it's almost like Christianity, where people can take that belief system and make it into sort of anything to fit their own like ideology. So like people who are very liberal might like take the liberal aspects of Christianity and say it's Christianity, and people who are super conservative can take Christianity and use it to justify their own like viewpoint on that. And that happens with Confucianism. People who want like radical change will cite Confucius, and people who want like super conservative values will also cite Confucius. So
people can cherry pick.
Yeah, he's an important scholar. What's something you like about Confucius? Maybe you can.
Oh man, to be honest, I was talking with another guy yesterday, and he's studied world religions and philosophies and stuff. Mm-hmm. I've always found Confucius a bit dry and dull. I've read about him over the years. I've read some of his sayings, and I've just never found him that interesting. I think he's very like practical. He talks about, again, harmony and relationships and authority, and you can see that in the culture. You can see that in the education system. But I've always
Yeah.
found him a bit dull compared to someone like Lao Tzu, who wrote the Tao Te Ching, and that's a lot more mystical and metaphysical.
Yeah.
But I'm more interested in things like that, the more abstract stuff. Or if you look at a lot of Western philosophy, I like Plato and Socrates, or Nietzsche. You and I, we've talked about Nietzsche. That stuff I can get into because I feel like it's thought provoking, and I think again that's a more Western inclination. We want to have thought provoked. We don't want to have rote memorization. We want to have discussions about interesting ideas. And I don't think Confucius really does that. Now, again, I'm not saying there's no benefits. I'm not saying he doesn't have any good ideas. I just find it's kind of like, well, here's a system and you should accept it and it works good. And people say, okay. And that's not a terrible thing. I just find it kind of boring.
Well, he has some good quotes. He has things like, before you seek out on a journey to seek revenge, dig 2 graves.
That's a good one.
I like that. And I don't know, he has some, I guess China was kind of torn apart at the time over like Civil War and stuff. And yeah, it had been bad. And then so he kind of sat down and was like, how have we gotten so off the right path and how can we get back onto it? And his solution was like the family and like no radical change and stuff. So yeah. He was kind of like the John Locke of China.
The problem is in the classroom. I was making them talk, and it was feeling that I was useless, to be honest. So I'd write a word. So I love, the English language has the most words of any language. We have the highest vocabulary, largest vocabulary in any language. So I love giving these certain words, and actually it can be a really beautiful language. But you write this stuff on the board, this information, no one would even pull out a pen to write it down. So it's somehow feeling I was an imposter, what I was doing was useless. So by gradations, I mean, I got that impression first of all, but then it was really a strong feeling, was that I was in a completely pointless job. That was my main problem, really, and just being a wage slave, just doing it for the wage.
Right.
That was it.
And I've heard that from some teachers, and then some will say, yeah, I'm just a dancing monkey or a white monkey or whatever.
Yeah, exactly, dancing monkey. But it was much nicer working in a university on the mainland.
And I've had jobs where I felt like it was kind of meaningless. Now I've also had jobs that I found very rewarding. Like I worked for a university in Beijing for a few semesters, and I had pretty good students, and I had some really good classes, and I had a lot of fun, and I thought that they had fun, and we had good rapport, and so I've had some really good experiences. And I started working in Zibo in September with middle school and high school kids, and I didn't think I would like middle school, but I've actually had a lot of fun with them. So I've had good and bad experiences, and I imagine anyone in any vocation, you do it long enough, you're going to have, highs and lows and good memories and bad memories. But when you mention like having jobs, and I've heard this a lot, and I've experienced it myself, but you don't feel like you're really doing much, like you're just a figurehead. Again, I feel like it's almost a matter of face, like it's prestige. Like for the school, they like to say we have X number of foreign teachers, and if the parents see white faces or foreign faces, especially white, it adds face, it adds prestige. And I feel like, and again, that's as far as it goes. It's like, oh, they have foreign teachers, awesome.
Yeah, I think so.
And that's it. And like, it doesn't matter if the students actually learn anything. It's all about, again, reputation, face, image, prestige. Parents like to brag to other parents. I've heard, oh, well, did you know that my child has a foreign teacher? My student goes to the international school. And again, I'm not saying we don't have a bit of that in the West. A lot of people, I think, could make a good case that we do. I just feel like it's so much stronger. And I feel like in the West, you'd have parents maybe bragging or students, oh, I go to this prestigious school. But there's also going to be the substance, not just the name. There's also going to be like, but I'm also learning and getting a good education, and or at least a belief. Whereas, again, in China, it's just surface level. It's just, and that's why a lot of schools, I think, will hire teachers and not really think it through and not really always vet the teachers. And sometimes you get some really bad people as a result. But it's just about, we have this quota. We want to have some foreign teachers that gives us face. And they don't think beyond that. They don't think about the quality of education and let's train the teacher, or let's teach them about Chinese culture. And that's part of what I'm trying to do here with these interviews and my research is sort of create, something for teachers who might be going to China to get, some insight. Because, when I first went, I didn't know anything. And being able to hear conversations like this, I think would have really benefited me. What would you say are some of the pros and some of the cons for teaching in China, either short-term or long-term? Like if someone was going to go to China to teach for their very first time, and again, they knew nothing about it, or they're curious, they're thinking about going, what would you, and they want an honest, not a sales pitch or not a recruiter, but they want to know honestly from someone with as much experience as you, what are some of the pros and what are some of the cons of living and working in China?
Okay, in easy life, there's less hours. If you work at a university or middle school, like where I am, you can get a good salary for not working very hard, not a 9 to 5. And if you was to go to an international school where you are working 9 to 5, you get a huge salary as compared to England. So the money is definitely one of the pros, and I believe it's why the majority of foreigners are there. Food is cheap. Houses are usually provided. So these are all good things. Of course, if you're a single man, Chinese women is, it could be hazardous dating them, but eventually, you'll find someone who's quite pretty and probably younger than you.
Now, what about for Western women in China? What do you think their dating prospects are like?
Well, they seem to be not interested in all the Western women I've met are not interested in Chinese men.
Isn't that interesting? Because a lot of people and myself have noticed that when you go to China, you'll see a lot of Western dudes with Chinese girlfriends or wives, but almost never will you see a white woman or a black woman or a Western woman with a Chinese man. Like I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I've never seen it. No, I take it back. I did see in Beijing, I think in my apartment complex, I had I never talked to her, but she was either a Russian or Eastern European woman, blonde hair, blue eyed. And she had I believe, a Chinese husband that she was living with. So it's not impossible, but it's very, very rare. And I think that's interesting.
I think if Western women want to date out there, they'll definitely find Chinese guys. There's a lot of available ones. So they definitely get that.
So it's the Western women who don't want to date the Chinese men and not the other way around.
That's the impression I get. I think they would love a lot of the Chinese men. As we find Chinese women exotic, I think they find Western women exotic, a lot of the Chinese men. But they seem not to be interested in them. So these are the pros. So, but at the same time, the cons are loneliness. Especially if you don't know how to speak Chinese, you're going to get very lonely. And even if you do know how to speak it, you're not going to find the same identification. As we said, they're not well read. It's superficial.
Right. Yeah, you won't necessarily have a great social life if you go to China. If you're like a very, very social person and you like to go out all the time, it can be a hard adjustment. If you're more of an introvert and you enjoy solitude and you enjoy reading or independent traveling, it can be great. And again, you can go to a city like Beijing or Shanghai and find other foreigners and like a nightlife and you know, have that. But
Yeah.
yeah, you're not gonna have the same social life you probably
If you
are
don't
used to.
if you don't drink as well, then a lot of stuff to do is off limits. There's a lack of things to do in China, like museums and interesting things to see. I mean, you can go and travel to cities that got that, but if you're living in a backwater like me, you know, you haven't really got a lot to do except go and sit in a coffee bar if you don't drink. Otherwise, you'll be in the
Right,
bar. So
right.
I never joined, you know, a football club or anything like that because there isn't really much of that around, or a
There's
meditation.
not a lot of options. Yeah, it's definitely good to go to China with like some hobbies and some goals, you know, like if if you were, for instance, like to be a writer, you know, like if you want to write a novel or a screenplay, I would say, yeah, go teach in China for a year or two, get a job that's, you know, 10 to 20 hours a week, and then use all that free time to like pursue that hobby, you know, to write that novel, whatever. Um, but
Mm.
yeah, sometimes it depends on your it's just good to have hobbies
My
and to
friend
keep
did.
yourself busy. So
Okay,
what would be some you kind of might have gone into this a little bit, but let me ask you, what would be advice you would give to someone going to China to teach for the first time? What should they know and how can they prepare? Let's make that my last question. What would be some advice you would give someone going to China the first time? What should they know? How can they prepare? Are there any, you know, books they should read? Are there any things they should bring from back home? What's your advice?
I would definitely read a history of China. I recommend a huge history of China by John Key. It's called China. John
Like
Key, that's spelled Keay. That's the best history of China.
Keay.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's the best history of China I've ever read.
Okay.
Because there's a lot of things people don't know about, like the Taiping Rebellion. You've read about that, Brandon, haven't you?
Is that the one with the Chinese guy declared he was Jesus's brother?
Yeah, that's right. His name was what was his name? Hong Xiu Chuan. What was his name?
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
I've
you
read
got
about that.
you got you. So if you went to like Nanjing, you'd know. I mean, it gives a romanticism to a place that otherwise wouldn't be there, and they have got some of
Mm.
the old wall in Nanjing weaving in and out of its modernity. You know, I
Uh-huh.
like that along that wall, thinking, you know, this is where the Taiping were. It's the bloodiest civil war in history, but it gives you a sense of where China is and where it was. If you're going to read
Uh-huh.
that book, um, talking
Are
about
there any other books? What about like Wild Swans? Did you ever read that? That was about the Cultural Revolution.
I did read it. Yeah, I liked it. It's a very simple book, straightforward. It's page turner. I like that. That'll
Yeah.
give you an idea of how fucking cannibalistic the Cultural Revolution was. Is they just ate each other up in that. Not literally, but well, sometimes they were.
Sometimes, yeah, there was some cannibalism, yeah.
Just how the culture is eroded by that. But I wouldn't read that and then, you know, try to enlighten the Chinese as to how terrible
No,
it is. Yeah.
no,
But it
no.
gives,
Yeah.
it's always good to appreciate just how long its history is and the events in it. So yeah, that's sort of middlebrow literature. That was it. Makes it more enjoyable than John Key would. One of the
Uh-huh.
best books I ever read on China was Paul Theroux, Riding the Iron Rooster. I think he was.
Oh, Paul Theroux. I have some of his books. I want to read that book. I haven't read that yet, but yeah, Riding the Iron Rooster. That's what it's called, right?
Yes,
Riding trains around in China. What was this in the 80s or the 90s, I think?
I think it's
I
the
think it might.
80s, but it was a
Yeah.
page turner, and it just showed you what is similar in China today, but also what's different. You know, they were much
Very interesting. Yeah.
great book that is.
I just thought of there's one book I would recommend to like again Western teachers going to China. It's by an American woman, and maybe she went like a decade ago. I don't remember exactly, but the name of the book is Pretty Woman Spitting. I forget the name of the author. You can find it on Amazon, and I think she just self-published it. and it's just kind of a memoir. But I read it, and there's actually a lot of memoirs about people who've lived in China, and that was one I really enjoyed. And I think she was in Anhui province, and she visited Nanjing and Beijing, and I found her observations and experiences to be just spot on. It kind of just everything that she documented, I was like, yeah, I've experienced that, or yeah, I know what she's talking about here. I think that's a really good book for anyone who wants to, even if people don't want to go to China, if they just want to know what it's like, I would say that's a great book to know what some of the experiences are. So let's see. What advice would you give to somebody going to China to teach for the first time? Now, this could be, maybe it's, an American student and they just graduated, got their undergrad degree, they got a teaching job in China, they're going to go, first time to China. Maybe it's someone who's taught in America 10 or 20 years, but they want to go try China for a few years. But regardless, a Western person, again, American, Canadian, Australian, British, going to China for the first time to teach, what is some advice you would give them?
Well, I guess if it's about teaching a second language, if this is their first time teaching a second language, I would definitely advise them to take it step by step. Don't get hung up on all the details, especially whenever the students are the younger as the students get. I was working with a guy, and he felt like he was teaching incomplete sentences. He said, what if a professor came in and saw that I was teaching incomplete sentences? Now, this is in kindergarten. I thought, man, yeah, sure, I totally get where you're coming from. But at the same time, you can't really expect children to get their prepositions right, really get them to understand the adverbs of frequency or whatever, it's just more about them building the skills so that whenever they're taught more detailed lessons, whenever their mind can really absorb everything, then sure, what the argument he was making does make sense. But if someone has a let's say an English degree or history degree or some kind of educational degree, and they come here to teach, I would say brace themselves. That's have an open mind, because even if that open mind does lead to more negative or I shouldn't say incorrect, but just a limited teaching style, or teaching content. I feel like if someone comes here, there is a bit of a reduction that a teacher has. Now, like I said, I did not experience this because everything was very new to me. Even though I'm teaching the basics of being able to speak English and being able to retain conversational pieces. I feel like anything more than that, if someone came in to teach middle school, high school, whatever they had in mind probably did not prepare them for what they're about to experience.
Yeah.
This is what I can't imagine someone with an educational background coming here and teaching and having the same expectation as what they did in their home country. I don't see it. So I would just say brace yourself, and have an open mind. And with my experience, I just stayed in my lane. I didn't try to change any kind of systems or anything like that. If someone comes in there wanting to change educational system that's not really expressed by the administration, that they feel like they want to be of value and that would mean changing the educational system, I think it's going to have a very negative reaction with the administration. So I would just say that it's almost like, do what you're told type idea. Other type of taboo conversations, yeah, I would say any kind of negative thing about the government, they will immediately shoot down.
Yes,
Um,
exactly.
I've never really tried that. Like I've had a conversation with someone that was open to listen to me, but I was very careful how I chose my words. Um, but unless you're speaking with someone that also expresses the same idea and they independently, and I should say unilaterally, gave that idea, then you can kind of express it. But just going out there uh, and expressing without any kind of uh, notions that it was okay, then yeah, I would say that your time here is, or whoever it is, their time here is going to be very difficult. Um, so I wouldn't really talk about the government at all.
And I think part of the reason that they don't like criticism towards the government is, again, this collectivistic nature that they sort of identify with it, and they almost take it personally, like, oh, if you criticize China or the government, you're criticizing me, and they don't like that. Whereas, again, I think in America we deal with criticism all the time. We criticize ourselves, we criticize our government, other people criticize our government, and we don't take it personally. Like, regardless of who's president, if somebody says, I don't like this president, or I don't like the previous president, or whatever, I just go, oh, okay, that's fine, that's your opinion. I don't take it personally. But I feel like in China, have you heard the phrase glass heart? Have you come across that ever?
Are you referring to like a very weak heart, being able to be offended very easily?
Yeah. Yeah, it's like a Chinese phrase, like their hypersensitivity.
Yeah, I would also say that, like, one example that I knew that I had said something wrong was someone said, well, the Minister of Foreign Affairs said this and this and this. So they were pretty much saying that it's true because that person said it. And I thought, you don't think he's just a mouthpiece? Like, you just accept everything the person says and that's it? You don't cross-reference any kind of data or examples or whatever. You don't do any other kind of research. You just listen to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and that's it. Once I said that, I knew the person kind of went quiet a little bit. So I knew that they also had a hard time detaching themselves from the government. Like you say, they are very attached. Like, it's almost like they feel that the government of China is the ethnicity or the nationality of Chinese people, and this is not true. This is so far from the truth. Like, I tell people whenever they do want to engage in a conversation with me about it, I tell them, I say, listen, in which they will criticize my government. Sure, they'll say, oh, well, the U.S. Army or the U.S. military did this and do that. I say, yeah, sure. We are covert about it. Like, we will do it in your face. But it seems that China is very sly and sneaky and try to control the narrative of everything. I say this is a huge problem. Like, I was trying. I couldn't really find any kind of information because my VPN wasn't working about a lot of foreign investments that China is making, about how they are. I guess it's called the Silk Road. I tried to explain this to them, and they could not accept it. They had no idea what was going on. They're like, I would be shocked if my government did this. And I'm like, listen, wake up.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I feel like, they take things on authority as gospel. Like, if on Monday President Xi says, you know what, I changed my mind, Japan is a pretty awesome country, I could see a lot of people going, okay, well, if that's okay, yeah. because they don't like Japan. But I feel like if the president came out,
right, yeah.
But then if the following week he came out and did a 180 and said, you know what, I changed my mind. Japan is evil. Everybody would be like, yeah, like it just like lemmings. Whereas again, I feel like in America, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican or Obama or Trump or whoever, president comes out and makes any statement, it's almost like a fraction of the country is going to agree, a fraction is going to be very critical, but not everybody's just going to accept it on the president's authority. And again, you're going to see more individuality and diversity in different groups and discussion and fact check, what's your source, blah, blah, blah. But in China, it's like, no, we all pretty much just accept this, even if it totally contradicts something that was said like last week. What would you say are some pros and cons of living, working, teaching in China? Maybe that can be our last question.
Okay, yeah. I definitely think there are a lot of pros living in China. Like, sure, you get to experience a different way of life, different thinking. Like, I'm sure that you're fully aware of the YouTubers that have risen to YouTube fame from
Yes.
living here. Now they live abroad, and they do have a different take on living and working in China. Some would say it's critical, some would say it's objective, some would say it's just outright against China. But I think that as someone lives here in China, they do develop a full understanding of their own country, I guess, namely myself. But I've heard, from other people, they're like, wow, living here really does kind of open my eyes up to the world. Even for myself, where I would go travel to 15 or so countries before I came here, didn't really give me any kind of true global perspective. Like, sure, you go to Italy, you go to Thailand, you go to the Philippines, you go to Ireland, go to Canada, go to Japan, and you get this kind of global type feel, but there's no real geopolitical understanding because everyone is kind of in accordance with each other. There's no kind of disruption between thoughts. Now, sure, I'm sure there are cultural differences, but in terms of general diplomacy, I don't think there's any kind of issues, no real big issues. But I would say here in China, you really get to see the differences between the two and how it's applied. And I do see how there are similarities with China and the U.S. and this is something that I do feel like is another benefit. China, they work hard, absolutely. In the U.S., we also work hard too, but we are also given our rights. So I think that I do have some qualities that Chinese do possess as well. When it comes to maybe the negative things that I've experienced, I would say people they will create lies about you. I've had this happen to me. Simply because I'm a foreigner. Now, I've heard. I'm not sure if you've heard the situation where if a foreigner goes into a Chinese person's house and they see maybe like an artifact or something, or a painting or something small, they'll say, "Oh yeah, I like that. That's nice." The Chinese person, they would be so nice, they'll give it to you. They'll say, "Oh, here, I want you to have it. This is my gift to you." And in our culture, like, no, listen, we can't accept that. No. But Chinese people, they do insist on a lot of things. So let's just say they insist it, and you take it as a gift, as a bridge between the two. The how can I say, the bonding relationship, whatever. And then you leave with the artifact, and then as soon as you close that door, the Chinese person will say, "Ah, this person took this from my house. they took it from me without really acknowledging the fact that they gave it to them.
That they insisted.
And it was, yeah, it was refused first, and then they, yeah, like you said, they insisted. So I've seen this kind of situation happen in different ways. You know, I don't want to add too much of my little personal stories, but yeah, I've had people make up stories about me, tell it to my friend, then my friend say, "Hey, is this true?" Obviously not. I'm like, "Listen, you know
Lots of
what I
gossip.
do day in and day." Yeah, it's ridiculous. Or what happens is or this happened to me. They'll invite you to dinner, and they'll pay for the first time, and then, you know, and that's fine. Then they'll invite you to dinner again, and then they'll expect you to pay for the next time without you really even knowing what's going on. And then if you pay, they'll say, the stupid foreigner, stupid foreigner. Foreigner's always going to be wrong in some people's eyes. Doesn't
Yeah.
matter if what we do is for it's a benevolent gesture. We're always going to have the downside of the situation.
And
So I would
that's
say
the
that
thing.
that's.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was going to end and say, yeah, that's probably the most negative parts about my experiences here.
What advice would you give to someone going to China to teach for the first time? What should they know? How can they prepare? We talked about that a little bit, but maybe we can focus on that.
Yeah, so specifically, a teacher coming to China, one thing I would tell them to prepare themselves for is disorganization. We did talk about that earlier, but a lot of things just happen at the last minute and changes at the last minute. Paperwork regarding your visa or your pay or something at work, or the police are coming to do this and you have to do this. And there's a lot of stuff that just happens on the fly all the time. You're working on Saturday and you have to give this presentation. Be ready right now because it's Friday night, and you're just like, what? So that is definitely something you gotta be prepared for. And then student morale. If you're going to be working at a private school, specifically a boarding school, their lives are really regimented, like almost like a prisoner. Like when they're allowed to eat, when they're allowed to do this, when they're allowed to do that, lights off, time to sleep. And their weekends are usually filled with, at least my experience, more studying, more classes, more instruments. They don't get much love. And that's, I mean, in the way that we show love in the West, right? I guess like affectionate love from your parents, or showing that someone really cares about you. You're kind of just in this, they're just in this really structured, stressful system. And so their morale in class is really low. Even if they like you and your class is fun, they're just going to be tired. So those are two things that were hard for me to deal with.
What are some things you found that maybe work for you as a teacher? Like, are there any, methods or games or things you like to do in class that you think, work well in China? Any like strategies or tips or just what do you think works?
No, it's really hard for me to give advice that go across the board, because everyone has really, really different outlook and philosophy for how they should teach, or what they're actually even doing in the classroom, right? Some people think they're there to, like some teachers think they're there to mold these minds and create these people that are going to be good citizens or whatever. Or some of them are just like, I'm just trying to get them ready for college. And some people are like, I want them to actually be the best version of themselves, and I want to help them figure that out. So those are three totally different people, right? So depending on what kind of person you are, I don't even like giving advice because of that. But for me personally,
let's just you personally, not necessarily advice, but what has worked for you?
Showing them that it's okay to make mistakes, and that it's okay to give me their opinion. A lot of them are really afraid of that. because of the reaction they had from parents. And I've had lots of really bad experiences showing myself when I was young to adults, and even into college, where I'm just like, oh man, he really embarrassed me because I said that about myself and he thought that was stupid, all right, or something like that. And it's really scary to do that. So for me personally, I want students to know that it's okay to try and be yourself in front of me, but I tell them two things: is just because that's okay with me, don't expect that with everyone else, because some people will not allow you to be that way. In fact, they will shame you. So I preface that saying, with me it's okay, don't expect all other adults to do that, because some adults don't even do that to each other. And secondly, I say embarrassing things about myself, things that mistakes I've made. Yeah, like, and I don't just mean being silly. Like, I do be silly in front of class, so it's okay to, have fun. But I'll say like really big life mistakes I've made, so they can see like, hey, this is a person that maybe would be okay with me sharing my mistakes, because you don't want to share your mistakes to someone that is perfect, because then you're gonna feel like they're gonna judge you.
Right. So you show your own flaws and maybe vulnerability.
Yeah.
Okay.
And some people will say, you do not do that. You do not smile the first 3 months of class. Like, some teachers will have this absolutely different perspective on how they want to run things. And I tried. I'm not a big fan of Oprah, but there's one quote. That's a whole other story. But there is one quote that said, like, be the person that you needed when you were younger. I don't know if she made that up herself or she got it from somewhere else, but that resonates with me because I went through a lot of bad stuff. And so when I think back, like, man, it would have been really nice if I had someone who was like this at this moment. So I try to be that.
What advice would you give to someone going to China to teach for the first time? Someone's going to go to China to teach. It's their first time. What would you say they should know? How could they prepare? What advice might you give?
Well, the best advice, and I wish that I had this advice myself, and it's mostly that China is just very, very different, and it's not necessarily better or worse. It's just, you have to understand that it's really different, and it's not going to change and like conform to what you might like. Like, I remember, especially towards the end, and it's kind of sad for me that I had to go through it, but like, it was sort of when the political thing was happening with like South Korea's THAAD and their missile defense radar or whatever, and like the people were like really, really angry about like the US like intervening in Chinese affairs and stuff. And so I felt like this overwhelming like sense of like hostility towards me and towards the foreigners. And then I got like really defensive and like I was just unhappy, or like I'd be sitting at like a restaurant and people would just be staring at me, and I'd just be like, what are you staring at? And just drove me crazy. Or like people would like, I'd be like eating at a restaurant and people would just start smoking a cigarette like right next to me. Yeah. And like even in like other countries I had been to, there were different cultures from America. They'd still smoke a cigarette in the restaurant, but they'd ask like, do you mind if I smoked a cigarette? In Colombia and stuff, but in China they would just like light up the cigarette, and it would like drive me crazy. And I would just say that if you're going to go to China, you have to just realize that it's going to be really different like that, and it's not necessarily even worse or better, but it is different. And if you criticize it, you're not going to be any happier. You're going to be much less happy.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. And I would say, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, just go along with it. Don't criticize. Yeah, don't criticize. It's not going to help. It's just going to put people on the defensive, and it's going to make you less popular. So people do things that make you upset, and people will do things that make you upset. You don't have to like it, but you're better off just remaining silent and complimenting when you can, you know. And even if someone is staring at you or pointing at you in a restaurant, maybe that's not the most pleasant thing for you. But if you don't take yourself as seriously and just sort of laugh along with it and go, okay, how am I supposed to eat this? And sort of play along with it and realize their intentions aren't necessarily bad. If I had done that, I would have been a lot happier. And at certain times I would go along with it, you know. Like I actually visited like the Confucian Institute and stuff. And this is another really big difference between America and the US. If you go to like a national site in America, like Yosemite, you're gonna see like Germans and Israelis and just, you know, Americans, Japanese, all sorts of different people. But when you go to a national site in China, it's like all Chinese people. It was like packed, but only Chinese. I was the only white person. I was the only non-Chinese person, really. And so like, people were like taking pictures of me and like pointing at me and stuff like that. And in that case, I actually went along with it. I was just like, hey, how's it going? And like, I just let them take a picture of me.
Yeah.
And whereas some people might have gotten upset with that, or I've even heard of like foreigners like taking pictures back and stuff. And that kind of thing might be tempting, but actually when I went along with it and just sort of laughed and let them take my pictures and said hi and stuff like that, I was so much more happy. So yeah, I would just avoid being critical or getting frustrated.
Yeah. Don't be publicly critical. Like, you can privately, you know.
For a close friend, you could say, God, you know, I get a little bit annoyed when people take my picture. And I'll say, oh, don't worry about it. It's just that they're interested in you because they've never seen anyone like you before.
Sure. I do think it is usually just curiosity, but there's been many times over the years in China where I felt like I kind of emphasized with celebrities who go off on paparazzi. I remember when I was younger, you'd see footage of a celebrity like punching a photographer, and I'd be like, oh, that celebrity's a jerk. I'm never going to watch his. But then after being in China and having that sometimes constantly in my face, I started to go, you know, and some days it would just it would just irritate me. And I'd be like, okay, I understand sometimes why celebrities get irritated with this because they're just trying to go for a walk and they've got people bouncing around them and it's just like, leave me alone.
For a walk.
Yeah.
If that kind of thing would bother you a lot, then maybe you shouldn't go to China.
Yeah.
But if you are in China, I'm not even trying to say this like condescendingly towards anyone, but just to help them out, that I would just say it is very different. And if you just criticize it and are unhappy, you're just going to make yourself more unhappy.
Sure.
And the best thing to do is to just not take yourself as seriously and just go along with it. And if you need to confine with like a close friend in private later. But don't be like, don't take my picture. It's not
right. Yeah, sometimes you just have to grin and bear it. You know, and go ahead.
Like, I remember there would be like spit in restaurants. Like people like indoors would like spit and you like put your backpack down and there'd be like spit. And you're like, God, what is wrong with these people? But if you complain, then it doesn't make it any better. So just you learn to put your backpack on a chair or whatever.
Got to adapt. Yeah, they do spit a lot, and that's one thing. A lot of people going to China their first time, whether they're Filipino or American or British or whatever, will comment on the spitting, the constant loud spitting.
Yeah, and I would say don't bring that up with any Chinese people because it will not go over well. But just be careful about where you put your backpack down.
Yeah, and watch where you're stepping sometimes, you know, watch where you're walking. So one other thing
can I add one thing that even though it was easy to get sort of annoyed by the different cultures in China and like people pointing or taking a picture or spitting and stuff, I found that overall they had an almost like juvenile, kind-hearted, warm-hearted sense. Initially it might be a little like irritating when they're pointing and stuff, but really they had like a good heart, and I never really had like sort of a mean sense from anyone. And so even though like the pointing and stuff could get a little annoying, once I actually like played along and was curious or asked a question about their culture, I found them to be sort of warm-hearted and like curious and like maybe I'm not really expressing myself as well because I'm a little tired, but things like taking a picture, it's not necessarily offensive. They're not trying to like stick it to a foreigner. They're just genuinely curious, and once you get to know them more, you'll see like a more warm-hearted culture, and you'll see that in a like personal relations. And so there's actually a lot to discover if you're willing to like have your picture taken with Chinese people and stuff like that. And that was kind of like a warm, positive aspect to it.
Sure. Now, one thing you said earlier I want to react to is you said, China's very different from America, and it's not necessarily better or worse. It's just different, and I think that's pretty good. That's kind of how I feel about it. Because when I compare the two, or when I think about life in China, I think in some ways it's better and it's more comfortable, and I think that's why I've worked there so many years. In other ways, it's less convenient than America. For example, it's obnoxious to me sometimes that I have to use a VPN to access the internet. Sometimes the bathrooms aren't up to standards I prefer. So there are some cons, but generally I always feel like in China, in spite of the disadvantages of the cons, generally I feel like the pros outweigh the cons. And when I've gone back to America, usually the first few weeks I'm doing all the things I miss, I enjoy. But then after a while, I start to miss certain things from China, and I start going, I kind of miss this and that. But anyway, so I guess for my last question, I have something written, but I'm actually changing it. I just want to ask you, and again, maybe we've touched on this already a bit, but to conclude, what, in your opinion, would you say are maybe some of the pros of living and teaching in China, and what would you say are some of the cons?
Well, it's a big question, but there are a number of pros. One of the pros was I got a large apartment for myself for a good price, for a cheap price, whereas that definitely would not be the case in Central Coast, California.
Right.
So yeah, this beautiful apartment that I liked, and it was actually pretty quiet and peaceful. Even the like shower was like a high flow, warm shower and stuff like that. And so that was pretty nice. And I felt like I was paid pretty well. I was able to save up my money. There wasn't a lot to spend money on actually. But I guess that's one other little tip I could give people is you can actually buy a more comfortable mattress. I went a year without sleeping on this sort of like.
Oh yeah, that's something we should maybe point out. Yeah,
hardboard like beds.
They like hard furniture and hard mattresses. Yes.
Yeah, I slept on that for a year.
Yeah, that hasn't come up in any of my conversations yet. I'm glad you brought that up because that's been one of my issues, or a lot of people, is you get to the apartment they provide, which is great, but then the couch and the bed, it's like a rock, and you're like, where's the mattress? And they're like, that is the mattress.
Yeah, where's the mattress? Yeah, that happened, and I just sort of like subconsciously or something just went along with it. I was like, God, these beds suck, and trying, but I slept on that for a year, like I say, and then they're like, you want, that's part of the other thing. My school was like, oh, are you cold or anything? Can we get you anything? I was like, yeah, could I have some more blankets because I'm quite cold. And they actually did provide some blankets and stuff. But then I slept on the bed, and then after like a year, I was like, God, the bed's kind of uncomfortable. Is there any way to buy like a mattress or something? Oh yeah, no problem. We could just order it online. And like the next day, I like bought like a perfectly nice, comfortable mattress for not very much money. God, I wish I did this a year ago.
That's definitely something I would advise people to do day one, is first see if your school, maybe bring that up with the school, because they usually bring up the mattress, and then if they can't or aren't willing to or whatever, go ahead.
It was delivered to my door.
Okay. Because one of the things I did when I went to a university in Beijing, I got to the apartment. It was a nice apartment, nice TV, nice bathroom, fully furnished. refrigerator, everything. But yeah, the quote unquote mattress is like a piece of cardboard, and I slept on it for maybe a few weeks, and it was literally just killing my back. So I was in Beijing, and one of my friends' coworkers had the same issue. We were in the same complex. So one of the first things we did was we went to IKEA, and I think our first paycheck, we got like deluxe, really, really nice mattresses. And I still have mine in Zibbo. I actually had it transported. So I've had my mattress a couple of years. I would say, yeah, if you're going to be in China for a year or longer, it is well worth investing in a nice mattress. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, that. And they also have some convenient apps and stuff. However, it wasn't a year, but maybe about 6 months in, and they're like, oh, yeah, you could have food delivered to your door and stuff. And it was really convenient. There's apps. Yeah. Someone showed me how, and they would just deliver good meals, and you could select them just by like clicking on the picture, and they actually deliver it to your door pretty fast. That's something, if someone's going to go to China, and just ask your friends about that, and you could actually have like pretty good food delivered to your door, and it's kind of cool.
Yeah, and even like McDonald's does delivery. I don't think we have McDonald's delivery in the States.
No, or KFC that you could like order it ahead of time and then like go there and pick it up. That's convenient.
Yeah, and it's the same here in the Philippines. They have McDonald's delivery and KFC delivery, and in America we have pizza delivery. I think there's some apps like Food Panda or something. I think it's becoming more common, but I find like in Asian countries almost everywhere seems to deliver.
Yeah, it's amazing.
So okay, those are some of the anything else in terms of pros and cons you think are worth mentioning?
I can't think of too much. I guess one other little pro tip, I guess I could say, is like giving gifts goes over very well, and that's something that sort of came naturally to me. But I guess maybe some people want to like keep money to themselves or something, but I was always like given like the guards of my apartment complex like packs of cigarettes and stuff.
Right.
And I'd go over, I wouldn't do it all the time, but maybe like once a month I'd give them like a pack of cigarettes, and that went over extremely well. Or like if you're going to any, like if anyone ever invites you to their house, that's a big compliment, by the way, if that ever happens. But it's always a good idea to bring a gift or two. You'll never go wrong. I remember, I don't know. And a more pro tip is to bring 2 gifts, because there's a thing about Chinese culture that one is kind of lonely and sad. So if you bring like 2 bottles of wine, it's always better than bringing 1 bottle of wine or something. So it went over well. I'd bring little gifts and it would go over well.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Cool. Anything else? I think that we've covered everything I really want to cover. But is there anything you might want to just throw in?
Just have a positive attitude. Like I say, you'll never go wrong by complimenting the Chinese when you're there. So just things you don't like, stay silent. Things you do like, compliment them a lot, and go have a good trip.
If you don't have anything good to say, don't say it.
That's right.
All right.
Right.
Cool. I think we could stop here. Thank you for participating. Let me stop the recording.